history of mortgage lending. And then I want to talk more recently about how we do commercial real estate finance, and then residential real estate finance. And then if I have time, I'm going to try to get into discussing. I have to open the blackboard here. I've never done this. It's a massive door, and someone was lecturing about astronomy. So I'm going to be talking about, when we talk about real estate finance, it's really about financial contracts that involve real estate, and that particularly use real estate as collateral. So it's a very complicated history, but I like to put things in a long-term perspective. So the word, I want to start with the word. The word mortgage. It actually goes back to Latin, mortuus vadium, and that means in Latin death pledge. Okay, and then in the Middle Ages in France, they substituted the French word for vadium, and that's, I don't know how to pronounce it. That means pledge in French, and I don't know why they call them death pledges. That doesn't seem to involve death to me, but it's in the long history of these institutions it became important. So the Oxford English Dictionary says the word mortgage entered the English language in 1283. So we've got a long history here. But actually, I can take it back further than 1283. And I was inspired by the research of Yale historian Valerie Hansen, who has been reading old documents related to the silk trade. And her documents are based on a trove of old documents from the Tang Dynasty in China between the 7th and 10th centuries, which reflect loans that were made to finance trade. So you had people going back and forth from the Middle East to China with silk and other items, and they needed financing for the trade. So she reads these old documents in Chinese, and I was looking over her work a little bit to see whether they had mortgages. She says that in China, they didn't seem, at least if I'm getting her generalities right, they didn't seem to mortgage property, at least in these documents. But she says that among these documents are some, they weren't all in Chinese because they were trading between China and many other countries. So she found some in this Sogdian language. She reads all these languages. It's an ancient language of what's modern-day Iran, and it's a dead language. It died out in the 9th century. But she finds some Sogdian documents that look like mortgages. So some people borrowed money for the silk trade, and they would mortgage their property or their slaves. You could mortgage slaves. It's an awful thought. And then the contracts would additionally say that you were obligated to maintain the property or the slaves. I guess that meant feed your slaves, keep them healthy. Those were mortgages from the, well, over 1,000 years ago. And so it's a very old institution. But I think it formed its modern form more recently. It became a well-known term for the general public, maybe in the late 18th century. I was trying to confirm that. I'm interested in history just out of, I don't know, just a passion for understanding origins of things. So I looked up mortgage on ProQuest to find old, what were they talking about? And I found an article in the Hartford Courant dated 1778. It actually wasn't an article, it was an ad that someone took out. And I think it's kind of revealing of what the mortgage market looked like in 1778. So we here in Connecticut have, did you know this, the oldest newspaper in America? That's the Hartford Courant. So a man by the name of Elisha Cornwell took out an ad in the Hartford Courant in 1778. And he explains in the ad that he lent money as a mortgage on somebody's farm. Actually, he sold his farm and was asked, and instead of taking the money right up front, he mortgaged the farm so that he sold it for 800 pounds and to another farmer, and the farmer was promising to pay him, and if he didn't pay him, he should get back the farm. So the farmer subsequently sold the farm, or did he mortgage it again? He mortgaged the same farm for 880 pounds, so he's made 80 pounds profit. It would all be fine and good, except he still hadn't paid back the first mortgage. And then the guy mortgaged it again for 1,000 pounds, and Mr. Cornwell is protesting, hey, you didn't pay me for the farm in the first place, so you don't own the farm. How are you mortgaging it multiple times? So he said, I thought I better put an ad in the newspaper so that any subsequent victims of this farmer would be warned. So that's the end of the ad. That he said, this is my farm, because he didn't pay me. But this shows how undeveloped mortgage institutions were in 1778, because he had to put an ad in the newspaper to explain that. The problem was that nobody had any systematic way of representing title. The farmer who bought it from, who supposedly bought it from Mr. Cornwell really didn't, and nobody would know that. He could fool people. So I think that's partly why you didn't see so many mortgages in those days, because you couldn't, the law wasn't clear. The institutions were not clear about property. And so you couldn't really do a mortgage business if you couldn't find out whether the guy mortgaging the farm really owned it or not. And so it wasn't until the late 19th century that government started to get property law, the rights to property, sufficiently advanced that we could develop a big national or international market in mortgages. So an important step is in Germany in 1872, or Prussia, the government created a Grundbuch law that created a system for Prussia that established in a book, a central book, who owns what exactly. That was in 1872. And in 1897, they made it a national German institution. Still, the United States did not have a Grundbuch at the time. It developed throughout the 20th century in different countries of the world that property rights would be clear enough that one could do a mortgage lending business. So that's why I think mortgage lending has really taken off in the 20th century. Hernando de Soto, who's a Peruvian economist, wrote a book a few years ago called Mystery of Capital, and it's about the developing world. He argued in that book that property rights, the problems that we just heard about from the Hartford Current, are still very big and alive around the world today, that you can't easily establish who owns what in many or most countries of the world. So that's a problem. That's why we don't see mortgage finance developing there. You can't make a loan. If you go to some small town in some less developed country, you can ask around, who owns this property? And they'll tell you, that's been in such and such a family for a long time. But if you want solid knowledge of that, how do you, if you're going to base a financial transactions on it, you can't base it just on hearsay, right? I mean, someone else might have a different opinion. So even today, in many countries of the world, the laws are not developed well enough. We don't have property rights established well enough, and we have laws that might inhibit mortgages. For example, in many countries, if you give a mortgage on a property, in other words, you lend on a property, and the person doesn't pay, you're supposed to be able to seize the property, right? But if the court system doesn't function well, or if it's kind of left-leaning and supporting the rights of the person living in the home, you might not be able to get it, or it might take you 10 years to get the guy thrown out of the house. Now, it seems cruel to throw someone out of a house who doesn't pay on their mortgage, but you have to think of the other side of it. If we don't throw them out of the house, no one's going to make a mortgage. You have to be able to get the house, right? That's the idea of a mortgage. The guy doesn't pay, the lender gets the house. And so I think there's a general process of development, improving the definition of property rights and improving the ability of lenders to get the property if it fails, which accounts for the advance of mortgage lending in the 20th and 21st century. So that's my long history of mortgage lending. But I want to get into some specific instances. I said I would start with commercial real estate. And and then I'll move to single-family homes or residential real estate. And I'm going to talk now mostly about the United States. This is too many countries to think about. But one thing about finance is that it tends to develop a sort of tradition and a sort of standard contract. It's encouraged by laws and regulators. It's, you kind of have to do the same sort of contract that other people are doing in your country. And I think the standardization is kind of a limitation. We can't be creative in financing because the public and the regulators will not be receptive to new things. Let me talk about some of the institutions in finance in the United States. It's natural to start with commercial real estate. So you see a lot of buildings around, okay? And the question is, how are they owned? I don't know whether you think about this. Who owns these buildings? Well, in much of the 20th century and still today, they tend to be owned as partnerships, real estate partnerships, which is different from a corporation. In a corporation, we talked about that yesterday, you might sell shares on the stock exchange if it's public, and it's defined as a legal person. And it has limited liability, so that all the shareholders don't have to worry about being sued as a result. But a partnership is different. And most real estate that's not part of a larger business is owned in a partnership rather than a corporation. And the reason is that they're taxed more favorably. Corporations have to pay a corporate profits tax. Okay, they're double taxed. You as an individual pay an income tax, and your corporation pays a corporate income tax or corporate profits tax. So you're taxed twice. If you incorporate yourself or you set up some friends to do business in a corporation, you get taxed twice. So you don't like that, and obviously you try to avoid that. The way to avoid it is not to have a partnership, not to have a corporation, but a partnership. You have to, the law allows you to form partnerships to own a building, say. So you're building, like, I don't know how, 360 State Street. It's a new building that just went up in New Haven. Do you know this building? It's the biggest construction. Does anyone know who owns it? It's probably a partnership. I haven't investigated that. Or it's called a direct participation program. So the partnership is an investment that is offered only to accredited investors. It's not generally available to the general public. And what is an accredited investor? The Securities and Exchange Commission takes it upon itself to define who are accredited investors that don't need the protections of the SEC. Basically, accredited investors are wealthy people, and it's defined in the SEC laws who is accredited. You have to have at least $1 million or minimum income. And so if you are an accredited investor, you can invest in a DPP, all right? And then the income of the property flows through to you as your personal income. It's not corporate income, so it's taxed only once. And you think about that, well, why would anyone form a corporation? Because I don't want to be taxed twice, so why don't we do all business as a DPP, as a partnership? The problem is that the government doesn't want you to do that, and so they have rules about what can form a partnership. And so one of the rules is that they have to have a limited life. So a corporation goes on forever, and it derives a lot of its value from the fact that it lives forever. There's no end date. So we talked about that when I brought up the first real corporation, the Dutch East India Company. The reason it got so valuable is people could see that this was growing. It's the first multinational. It was this huge company. It had all kinds of deals and alliances and business arrangements, and no one wanted that to end. The value came in the growth prospects for that. But a DPP has to end. So what you do is, it's well designed for a building. You buy the building, and you depreciate it over the life of the contract. And then there's an end date, and at the end date, you sell the building to someone else. And then you close down the DPP. You don't hear about these partnerships as much. You hear about companies, corporations all the time. You don't hear about DPPs, first of all, because they don't get so big. They're typically one building, 360 State, for example, all right? And it only lasts for however, 10, 20 years, then it's gone. Might have a different name. So it doesn't get advertised to the public because it's not available to the public. They can't go around trying to bring you in as an investor because they have to verify that you're an accredited investor. So it tends to be a project for wealthy people. Now, I mentioned that corporations have limited liability. Partnerships do not, in general. But you can have a partnership that involves two classes of partners. There's general partner that runs the business and does not have limited liability. In other words, if the business goes bad and loses money, the general partner can get sued. But there are other partners called limited partners, and they have to be passive investors, and they have limited liability. So what often happens is a DPP is created by someone who understands and knows real estate. Let's get 360 State Street built. You're going to know that eventually because once they open, they're going to open a supermarket in the first floor of 360 State. And I'll bet some of you will be over there because it'll be the closest supermarket to Yale University. But it's all part of somebody's plan. There was some general partner who thought up this structure and got limited partners in and is running managing the building or hires the manager for the building and has a plan and a closeout plan. The building won't disappear, but they'll sell it to someone else. I really don't know the financing structure of 360 State, but I'm just pointing out it's likely what's happened there. So that has been the modern structure of real estate. And if they mortgage the building, it would be the DPP would mortgage the building on behalf of the partners. So real estate finance in the United States, I might as well write it down. Just a DPP is a direct participation program. And it's direct in the sense that you as an investor are participating directly in the profits of it. You are a partner. You're not a shareholder. Okay. The DPPs became criticized in the 20th century because small investors couldn't access these. Small investors were confined because they weren't accredited, they weren't big enough or important enough. They were not allowed to invest in these. It was supposed to be to protect them, all right, I guess. But well, how does it protect them? To subject them to double taxation. So there it became a cause that why in the United States do we have most of our investors closed out of these lucrative investment opportunities? Why can't individuals, basically individuals couldn't invest in commercial real estate. And people said, well, people are supposed to diversify, they're supposed to hold different kinds of investments. So why would this be limited to them? So Congress in the United States in 1960 created something new called a real, I think the chalk is weak. I'm trying to be gentle, and the chalk can't, I'm not being rough, am I? It keeps collapsing. I'll be very gentle here. Real estate investment trust, or it's abbreviated REITs. These were created in 1960 by an act of the U.S. Congress, and it was a democratization, another example of the democratization of finance. And I believe it started here in the United States. Now they are being copied all over the world. They got off to kind of a slow start after 1960, but they have grown dramatically. And so the idea is that we will allow a company to, well, it would be a trust, to create investments for the general public, for small investors, and they won't be double taxed either, okay? So a real estate investment trust has to follow the law, and then it can invest in buildings. And so maybe 360 State is owned by a REIT, I don't know. But they are not subject to the corporate profits tax. Now, once again, once Congress creates a vehicle that's not taxed, everyone's going to ask, well, I want my company to be a REIT, okay? So they had to define it so that it isn't generally available. It's limited to real estate. So the law says 75% of the assets of the company have to be in real estate or cash. 75% of the income has to be from real estate. 90% of their income must be from real estate, dividend, interest, and capital gains. 95, this is all I think in your textbook, Fibozzi. 95% of the income must be paid out. And it has to be a long-term holder. No more than 30% of the income can be from the sale of properties held less than 4 years. They don't want, real estate churning companies. So if you define all of that, you've got a REIT. And so that invention, which goes back to 1960, it's one of those things in finance. It starts out slowly. Most people don't hear of it. And then it starts to grow. And REITs, and now they're everywhere around the world. Well, maybe not everywhere, but in many countries we have REITs. The U.S. REITs grew in a succession of booms. The first boom was in the late 1960s when the interest rates in the United States rose above deposit ceilings. There used to be ceilings that the government imposed on savings banks' deposit rates. And so suddenly the REITs were paying better than the savings banks, and the public flocked to them. There was a second boom after the tax reform of 1986 eliminated some tax advantages of DPPs and partnerships. It used to be that the government allowed generous depreciation allowances for partnerships, and people would invest in buildings just as tax dodges. Because if you're allowed to depreciate the building very effectively, you can kind of cook your profit so that it's not taxable. And so people were investing in buildings too much. The government created a distortion that encouraged too much investment in DPPs. So in 1986, the government made it harder for, it eliminated a lot of the advantages of partnerships, and that caused the second REIT boom. And then starting in the 1990s with the real estate boom, that the excitement the public got, suddenly lots of new kinds of REITs appeared, and REITs that involve specialized properties and the like. Now they're big, and everyone talks about them. But it's interesting to me that it took 50 years to get as big as they are now. And again, the theme that I'm recurring here, the recurring theme, a couple of them. One is that the finance industry finds it difficult to innovate, and innovations take many years to happen. And secondly, that there's a trend toward the democratization of finance. That if you go back in history, you'll find these same mortgages and partnerships and the like, but they were limited to a small number of wealthy people. And we're moving. With the invention of REITs, for example, more and more people are getting involved. Okay. So that's commercial real estate. I want to talk now about residential real estate, which is actually bigger. There are more houses than there are office buildings in this country, or there's more value in houses. So this is bigger. In the United States, about 2/3 of households own their own home. It varies across countries. but there are many other countries with similarly high home ownership rates. And this home ownership is a product of government policy that encourages mortgage lending. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of mortgage lending and the history of problems in mortgage lending. Now, I already took you back to the silk trade in the Tang Dynasty, but I'm going to be less so far back now. We're going to talk about the United States and the Great Depression. So the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s, after the 1929 stock market crash, was faced with a severe housing crisis. Home prices were falling, and people were defaulting on their mortgages in great numbers. In fact, the government had to create what they call the Homeowners Loan Corporation to bail people out, and they ended up bailing out 20% of American homeowners. It was a terrible crisis. So what was happening? I'm pointing this out because it's important in the history of real estate finance. Before the Great Depression, mortgages were growing, but I'll say before the Great Depression, they tended to be 2 to 5 years, and they were balloon payment. What do I mean by that? When you bought a house in 1920, you'd go to a bank, and they would give you a loan for 2 to 5 years. So if you bought a house for $10,000, they would typically lend you half the money. They'd lend you $5,000, and the loan would say, you pay interest every month until 2 years has ended, and then you repay the $5,000, okay? And then you could try to get another mortgage. You come back to us, and we'll do it again if we feel like it. Okay, that was the deal. Banks offered that, and it was becoming increasingly common. When we say a balloon payment, what we mean is it's really big. Balloons are big, all right? So you're paying monthly interest, but then in 2 years, you got to come up with the whole $5,000, all right? But okay, people thought, it's all right. I'll just go back to the bank, or maybe I go to another bank. So, I go wherever I want, and I can borrow $5,000, okay? So this was the way things were done. But what happened in the Great Depression? 2 things happened. The unemployment rate went up to 25%. A. B. Home prices fell, in many cases, by more than half. So if you borrowed $5,000 against a $10,000 home, your home might be worth only $4,000 now. So what do you do now? You go to a bank, okay? 2 years is up. I got to refinance my mortgage. I go back to the bank, and I show up, and I say, hey, I'm unemployed, and my house is worth $4,000. The bank says, no dice. You're not going to get renewed. So what happens? You're forced to dump your house on the market. You declare bankruptcy. You've lost everything. You've lost your $5,000 down payment. If you buy a $10,000 house and you borrow $5,000, then the other side is called your down payment. So that's what happened. It was happening to millions of Americans. And so the Roosevelt administration decided that the old kind of mortgage there was something wrong with that mortgage. So in 1934, when Franklin was a year after Franklin Roosevelt became president, they set up the Federal Housing Administration. And it specified that it was trying to get lenders back in to lend to homeowners because it was a catastrophe in the country. I'm not writing this right. So in order to get lenders back in, the FHA started insuring mortgages. And that meant that if you're a mortgage lender and your mortgage, the person you lent the money to doesn't repay you, and the house isn't worth enough, you can get the house, but you might lose money because the house has lost value, the government will make it up. So the government came in with what's called mortgage insurance. And at the same time, the government said all mortgages that are insured by the FHA must be 15 years or longer. And so the U.S. government imposed the long-term mortgage on the mortgage industry. And they said this is better because the mortgage, and secondly, it cannot be a balloon payment mortgage. The government said, this is really imposing too much on ordinary people, that they have to come up with a huge sum of money at the end of the mortgage. So they required that the mortgages be 15-year amortizing. Such mortgages had been offered already by some banks in the United States in the 1920s, but it was innovative finance and too complicated for most people. It never caught on. Let me understand, to amortize means to pay down the balance, okay? So an amortizing mortgage has no balloon payment at the end. A 15-year amortizing mortgage has a fixed monthly payment. You make it every single month. And at the end, you're done. You take your spouse out to dinner and you say, we've paid off our mortgage, we're done. So there's no family crisis at the end. It's a fixed monthly payment. Now, the arithmetic of amortizing mortgages is a little confusing to some people. And in 1934, it took some education. But I want to just describe the amortizing mortgage system. All right, so we're going to have a mortgage of maturity. The maturity of the mortgage is in is M, and that's in months, okay? So in 1934, they started out with 15-year mortgages, which they thought was pretty aggressive. But by the early 1950s, the FHA was emphasizing 30-year mortgages. That's a long time to pay off on your house. But the idea is, you know, your typical family, they get married and they're buying their first house. They're 25 years old, all right? So let's give them a full 30 years to pay off the mortgage. They'll be 55. Kids will be going off to college. They'll still be working. That's a comfortable length of time. Why not give them 30 years? And we guarantee the interest rate for 30 years. No surprises. You just know you have this monthly payment and you've got it. The question now is, how do we decide on the monthly payment? Okay? With the idea of an amortizing mortgage is that you have a fixed payment every month. You have an interest rate, and you want to make sure that the present value of the monthly payments equals the mortgage balance at the beginning. So the initial mortgage balance, that's the amount you borrowed, has to equal the present discounted value of all the monthly payments. So what will I call the monthly payment? Let's call the monthly payment X is the monthly payment in dollars. Okay, so the mortgage balance is equal to X all over R over 12, where R is the annual interest rate, times 1 minus 1 all over 1 plus R over 12 to the nth power. That's just the annuity formula. Okay, so that's the formula that's used to compute. Let me make sure. I've shown you that formula before. It's the present value of a stream of payments equal to X. Did I write R over 2? I meant R over 12. So what you have to do, if you are calculating an amortizing mortgage, if the person is borrowing the amount mortgage balance, and I quote a rate R per year, I have to plug that into the present value formula and find out what monthly payment, X, makes the present value equal to the amount loaned. Now that is a little bit of arithmetic that mortgage lenders would have had trouble doing. It's not that hard to do, right? But I have here a page from a mortgage table from, I found this in the Yale Library. Can you read that? This is from a 50-year-old book. This is before they had computers. And so it was too hard to do this calculation. But I just wanted to, can you read it in back? Sort of. This is for a 10-year mortgage. I just picked 10 years. That was uncommon. That's rather short. Some people would get shorter mortgages, especially older people. You know, if you're 60 years old, you don't want a 30-year mortgage. You probably won't live that long. So they did give out shorter mortgages as well. So this is a page from a mortgage book for 10 years. And this is for 5% mortgage. So it shows the monthly payment for $1,000. If someone's borrowing $5,000, you multiply this by 5. All right, but they show it for around $1,000. And the monthly payment, it says monthly payment per $1,000 is $10.61. So what they've done is they found out X, $10.61, is the X that makes this present value for R equal 5% equal to $1,000. They've done exactly this calculation. Now they show the payment schedule. And the payment every month is $10.61. But what this table shows is the breakdown between amortization and interest. So it shows the principal for each month. So you borrow at the beginning, you borrow $1,000 on this mortgage, and you're paying $10.61 per month. All right. So each month your balance goes down. This balance column, they subtract. Well, the question is, how do you figure it out? You're paying $10.61 per month, but part of that is interest. What part of that is interest? Well, it's 5% of 5% divided by 12 of the $1,000 balance at the beginning. So your initial interest is $4.17. So your principal is the $10.61 minus the interest. So then that reduces your balance. So the initial interest is $4.17. The principal is $6.44. So the balance is $993.56 after 1 month. The next month, they figure what fraction of your payment is interest by multiplying 5% over 12 times the balance, $993.56. And then that comes out to be $4.14 interest. You see, the interest is going to be going down because you're paying off the loan, but your payment is fixed. So the payment against principal is going up. So the first month was $4.17 interest. The next month is $4.14 interest. Offsetting that is the first month with $6.44 being used to pay off your mortgage. The second month it's more, $6.47. Okay, and this goes all the way down. I couldn't show the whole page here, but here after 6 years, 6 months, your interest is down to $1.74 because your balance is down to $407.61. But and so your payment of principal is much higher. So the reason this table is important is that people move and they sell their house early. They don't hold it for the full 10 years. So you have to figure out when someone sells his house after 6 years, 6 months, what do they still owe? Well, they now owe, instead of $1,000, they owe $407.61. So that's the idea of a long-term mortgage. Your interest payments are changing all the time. Your principal payments are changing all the time, but your total payment is fixed. That was an invention, a financial innovation in 1934. And it is now offered, this is called a conventional fixed-rate mortgage, and it's now offered in many countries of the world. However, there's only 2 countries where it's the major kind of mortgage, the United States and Denmark. And this is a strange thing. This invention has not caught on around the world. It's unique to only 2 countries, although you can get it in other countries. It's not available in Canada in any number. I guess you could find it, but it's not common elsewhere. Every time I go to a foreign country, I ask the people there, why don't you have fixed-rate mortgages? And I don't necessarily get good answers. I've been trying to understand why it hasn't caught on. Then I recently saw that Alastair Darling, who was under the Labour government Chancellor. I'm trying to be gentle here. Alastair Darling was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom until the Conservative government took over. And he issued a statement saying that UK should finally adopt the long-term mortgage. The problem is that any country that doesn't have a long-term fixed-rate mortgage runs the risk of falling into the same problem that the United States did in the Great Depression. Some kind of crisis like that could mean that people would lose their homes in great numbers. So he said he'd like to see the UK get people borrowing at 10, 20, or even 25 years for their mortgages. But instead, what happened was the Conservative government took over. But you can in the UK get long-term mortgages. And I think it's true in most countries of the world. They're just not common there. And it's a bit of a puzzle. Why is it that only 2 countries do this generally? I have a couple of reasons offered why it is. One of them is that the general public is resistant to long-term mortgages because they charge a higher interest. If the government is going to guarantee a rate for 30 years, not the government, the bank, the lender is going to guarantee it for 30 years, they're going to have to charge you a higher rate because that guarantee costs something for them. And consumers are resistant to paying the higher rate. And that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that bank regulators might not encourage banks to make these loans because it's risky for banks. If banks tie their money up for 30 years, and then they have depositors who can withdraw their money at any time, the banks could go under. If there was ever a run on the banks, they can't liquidate these mortgages fast at all. So you need a coordinated effort of a government to first make sure the regulators accept these concepts, and it puts some risk on the public of a possible bailout of the banking system. And then you have to get past public resistance. You have to make the public understand that when you get a fixed-rate mortgage, it's a clean contract. We have no worries for 30 years, as opposed to there are problems that have sometimes occurred. In Canada, in 1980, the government, the interest rate shot way up, and we had a kind of a duplicate of the problem that we saw in the U.S. People couldn't afford to refinance their mortgages, and a lot of people lost their homes, and so it was a big problem. But they somehow got through that, and they're not really thinking about fixed-rate mortgages in Canada even now today. I wanted to go on talking about innovation in finance. Another very important innovation is securitization of mortgages and government support of mortgage markets. So in the United States, in 1938, the federal government, this is also Roosevelt administration, set up the Federal National Mortgage Administration, which was a government agency that would buy mortgages to support the mortgage market. On Wall Street, they couldn't pronounce Federal National Mortgage, or is it association? I'm sorry, I have administration. Is it association? It's association, not administration. You know what they called it on Wall Street? They called it Fannie Mae. That was just an irreverent shortened name for the association. It was run by the government. However, it was in the year 1968, the U.S. government privatized Fannie Mae and it became a private corporation. So what did Fannie Mae do? It would buy mortgages from banks. They were trying to encourage the mortgage market. So a bank would lend money to someone to buy a house, And then they're done. They can't lend any more money unless they raise more deposits. Well, Fannie Mae would buy the mortgage from them, and they'd have money again to lend again. And so they did this in '38 because we were still in the Depression, and the housing market was still depressed. They weren't building homes. There were lots of unemployed construction workers. And so Roosevelt was just thinking, how can we stimulate the economy? And this was one of their ideas. So Fannie Mae was the mortgage finance giant that was created in 1968. I can shut this off here. In 1970, government created another Fannie Mae-like institution called, its official name was Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation, and Wall Street had to invent a name for it. So they called it Freddie Mac. Okay. They thought, well, we gave a girl's name to Fannie Mae, let's give a boy's name. I guess that's a boy's name. Now, both of these organizations called them, they're both private companies now, but created by the government. They both use these names officially now, so that's their name now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But Freddie Mac was initially different, because what the government asked Freddie Mac to do is buy mortgages and then repackage them as mortgage securities and sell them off with a guarantee, a Freddie Mac guarantee. And so once Freddie Mac started doing this, Fannie Mae said, well, can't we do that too? So they both do it. So what the government had done is create two private corporations. You kind of wonder, well, private corporations, why did the government even do that? Anyone can create. Remember, we have a corporate law. I can start my own Freddie Mac, okay, my own Fannie Mae. But the government did create them, well, by privatizing Fannie Mae and by creating Freddie Mac. And they were both in the mortgage securitization business. So they would buy from mortgage originators, people who lend the money, they'd buy the mortgages. In other words, they'd take the IOU from someone, they'd repackage them into securities and sell them off to the public with a guarantee from Fannie or Freddie that the mortgage, if there were a default, the mortgage extra balance would be made up by Fannie or Freddie. Okay. Well, they did then get other companies called mortgage insurers to insure at least part of the balance. So it's a complicated financial agreement. But what we had was private companies created by the U.S. government that created securities for investors that were guaranteed against defaults and based on mortgages. So the government then also stated that these are private companies and the U.S. government does not stand behind them. People started to say, the government created these two corporations, and now they're securitizing and guaranteeing trillions of dollars of mortgages. And is this going to come back and end up being paid for by the taxpayer? So the government stated clearly, these are now private corporations. Fannie Mae started out as part of the government, but no longer. Now it's a private corporation. And if Fannie Mae goes bankrupt, woe betide anyone who bought their securities, because their guarantee is not backed up by the federal government. So people complained, though. They said, you're saying that it's not backed up by the federal government, but do you really mean that? If Fannie or Freddie goes bankrupt, will the U.S. government just let them go under? Well, the official statement was, yes, the government will let them go under. Guess what happened? Okay. In 2008, the real estate market crashed, and we had our first housing crisis that was similar to the Great Depression. And in that housing crisis, both Fannie and Freddie went bankrupt. Okay? And now, what do? We're in the Bush administration, Republican. They don't particularly like bailouts. Okay? So you'd think, of course, George W. Bush would just, it's the law, right? The federal government's not going to bail them out. But then some people said, wait a minute. You know, all over the world, people are investing in these, thinking that, well, Fannie Mae was created by the U.S. government. In particular, a lot of Chinese, those poor innocent Chinese, were trusting the Americans, and they put many billions of dollars into Fannie Mae. Are you going to go and tell the Chinese, sorry, you know, we won't back it? Well, someone could say, sure, go tell them that. It's what we've been saying all along. But then the Chinese could come back and say, well, you've been saying that, but nobody believed you. Everyone knew that that wasn't right. And the federal government didn't take all the right steps to make it really clear. For example, the Wall Street Journal used to list Fannie Mae bonds and Freddie Mac bonds in a section of the newspaper entitled Government Securities. And that's the Wall Street Journal. That's not the government talking. But, you know, the U.S. government should have come in and told them, no, those are not government. So we poor, innocent Chinese investors, we read your paper and it said government securities. Now, George Bush could have said, tough luck. You know, you guys, you should have read the fine print. But he didn't, all right? Why not? Because it jeopardizes too much. If the U.S. government lets these agencies that it created go bankrupt, and it lets all those people all over the world who invested in those securities, they're going to be mad, right? And, you know, we have a reputation. The United States is able to raise so much money from all over the world because they think that it's safe here. And if we just let these fail, it's not going to look right. So the U.S. government took them both under conservatorship and is paying their debts, paying off. So those did not default. And what we learned from this lesson is that you can say $1 million times that you're not going to guarantee something. But when it comes eventually, you end up guaranteeing it. I wanted to say something about other countries a little bit. Canada has something like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac called the Canada Housing and Mortgage Corporation. So I'll just talk about other countries. The Canada Housing and Mortgage Corporation. And it was created in, I actually don't have the year, but it was created by the government of Canada, and it does work that resembles FHA, and it resembles Fannie Mae, but it's owned by the Canadian government. It's not privatized. And so you might say, well, it's the same in Canada, but the big difference is it's smaller. They didn't let it get as big as Fannie and Freddie, and so it isn't heard as much from. I was a keynote speaker at a conference February 3 that the Financial Times organized in New York called Focus on Canada. And I had to give a talk about Canada to New York investors. They told me there were hardly any Canadians in the audience. So what are we doing here in New York talking about Canada? Well, it's because the Americans invest heavily in Canada. So I was up talking to all these American people, and I was looking at Canada and Canada banking system, and I said to the group, you know, Canada and America are just so similar. I can't see much of a difference. And the recent financial, Canada didn't have Fannie and Freddie. It didn't have these housing problems, but the worldwide recession hit Canada pretty hard. And so I said, Canada and U.S. are kind of like two peas in a pod. That's what I said. They're so similar. People like to make much of differences, but the Canadian economies just move up and down in lockstep. And I also said Canada was saved by the oil crisis, being an oil exporter. And if it didn't have the oil, in 2008, remember when the oil prices shot up? But little to my knowledge, there was a reporter for the Financial Post in Canada in the audience, and my talk got reported in the Financial Post. And then I went on their website, and there's blogs, angry blogs from Canadians. I don't think it's so insulting to Canada to say that we're just basically similar. I didn't, and yeah, I'll have to say this for Canada. They did not get so gung-ho on supporting mortgages as the United States did. So they didn't have such a big housing bubble that the U.S. did. Part of the reason the U.S. had a housing bubble as big as it did is that the U.S. government, see, these guys really weren't independent. They were taking orders from the government, and the government was telling them to increase their lending to low-income or to underserved communities. They were promoting the bubble, and so Fannie and Freddie were told to promote lending to houses during the real estate bubble that preceded the crisis. That didn't happen, at least not so much in Canada, so they've had less of a bubble. But still, the two countries are basically very similar. So I think the textbook talks a lot about mortgage securities, and there's major category. I expect you to read this out of Fabosi. I actually got complaints. I'll tell you, in past years, students found this the least enjoyable part of the readings for this course. But you should know about these things. So we have securities called collateralized mortgage obligations. These are mortgage securities that they're securities that are sold off to investors, and they hold mortgages. But as it's explained in Fabosi, they will divide them into separate tranches or separate securities in terms of prepayment risk. That is, there's a risk that the mortgages will be paid off early in times when it's adverse to the investor interest. So they would divide up the risks into different classes of securities. And some of them were rated AAA by the rating agencies because they thought there was almost no risk to those securities. And others were rated differently. And these CMOs were sold to investors all over the world. Another kind of security which the textbook talks about is a CDO, which is a collateralized debt obligation. And these are issued to investors, and they typically hold mortgage securities as their assets. Many of them held subprime mortgages in recent years, mortgages that were issued against subprime borrowers. A lot of these securities that were rated very highly by the rating agencies, rated AAA, ended up defaulting and losing money for their investors. And the investors were all over the world. The United States is a leader in mortgage finance, and it was issuing, companies in the United States were issuing, not just Fannie and Freddie, but lots of companies were issuing mortgage securities that had AAA ratings, which meant that Moody's and Standard & Poor's and the other rating agencies were telling you basically there was no risk to them. And so people in Europe, in Asia, were investing in these, and they thought they were perfectly safe, and then they went under. And part of it was bad faith dealings by some of the issuers. Some of the issuers themselves doubted that these mortgages were so safe. But what do I care? This is what happened. Somebody originates, it's gotten to a complicated set of steps. Somebody originates the mortgage. Okay, that means I talk to the homeowner, I have the homeowner fill out the papers. Then after they've originated the mortgage, they sell it to an investor, okay, like Fannie or Freddie or some private mortgage securitizer. And the private mortgage securitizer finds a mortgage servicer, it may be the originator, who will then service the mortgage. What does it mean to service a mortgage? It means to call you on the phone if you missed your payment, for example. Or if you have questions about the mortgage, there should be someone you call. So the mortgage servicer does that. So that's a separate entity. And then we have the CMO organizer, the originator. And then we have the CDO originator. It's gotten to be a very complicated financial system. And then the whole thing collapsed. So there's been a lot of reform to try to see what can we do to prevent this kind of collapse. Some people would say, let's end the whole thing. Let's go back to 1778. Let's not have mortgage securitizers. But that's not the steps that have been taken. And I think that we are making progress. And I want to just conclude with just a little reference to one important change that was made in both Europe and the United States. So the European Parliament passed a new directive that requires or incentivizes mortgage originators to keep 5% of the mortgage balance in their own portfolio. So that means if you originate a portfolio, you can sell off, if you originate mortgages, you can sell off 95% of the mortgages to investors, but you have to keep 5%. So this 5% limit was then later incorporated into the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States. So we again have the same requirement. And this is supposed to reduce the moral hazard problem that created the crisis and retain the mortgage securitization process. So the idea is this. And I know I heard people tell me, mortgage originators sometimes got cynical. They thought, okay, I'm helping this family fill out a mortgage. What do I care? You know, I think this family doesn't look, they're not going to pay this back. But what do I care? I'll fill it out, I'll sell the mortgage to someone else, and I'm out of here. In fact, it got bad in some cases. Some mortgage brokers, a family would come in wanting to buy a house, and the mortgage broker would say that, well, what is your income anyway? They would tell him the income, and he would say, well, you're trying to buy a $300,000 house on that income? I said, I don't know if I can do this. But then he'd say, wait a minute, think about this again. Is that really your income? You told me your income is $40,000 a year. Are you sure? Don't you have some other? Why don't we say $50,000 a year? Or I'll say $60,000 a year. And the couple would look at him in disbelief and say, no, we only have $40,000. He said, well, think about it. You have other sources, don't you? And he said, you know, everybody does this, you know. So, okay, we have $60,000. He says, fine. And they thought, well, the mortgage broker gave me permission to do this. And he doesn't care because he's not going to take the loss. So the new law is supposed to discourage that kind of thing. And there's lots of new laws that are trying to tighten up. For example, mortgage brokers in the United States now have to be licensed. It used to be just 5 years ago, you could be an cschan, fresh out of jail, and you can take up a business as mortgage broker. You can't anymore. So what's happening all over the world is that we've learned from this experience, but we're retaining this basic system of mortgage securitization. Mortgage lenders that are professional, the basic industry has been retained, and we're hoping and thinking that maybe we have a better system. So I will stop there, and I'll see you on Monday. So I want to talk today about behavioral finance, or about psychology in finance. This is a long-standing interest of mine. I've been involved with it for over 20 years. It's not really emphasized in your textbook. Fabozzi and his co-authors talk about a lot of things in the financial world, but not about the underlying human behavior. Behavioral finance, or behavioral economics more broadly, is a kind of revolution that has occurred in finance and economics over the last 20 or 30 years. And it remains somewhat controversial. I don't quite fully understand why it is that people polarize as much as they do, but some people don't like this. Other people, I think, we're coming along to be the majority, I think. People are now regarding behavioral finance as an important element of finance. And so the real problem is that people are complex, and our financial institutions, as I've emphasized, are designed for real people, and their functioning depends on the behavior of real people. And it's not as simple. You know, another revolution that's occurring parallel, of bigger significance, is a revolution in neuroscience about the human brain. And the human brain is a very complicated organ, and it's not. Economists have liked to invoke the principle of rationality as an underlying component of their theory, and that has been useful, but it's of limited use because people aren't rational. They're often rational, they're not completely rational. And very often people behave stupidly. I'll put it that way. That includes everyone, including me, because we're human and we have limits. And that encourages one thing about the human species is that we are aware of other people's weaknesses and have an impulse to exploit them. Okay, so when you see other people behaving stupidly, sometimes you think, maybe I can turn this to my advantage. Okay, and that becomes a problem. The history of humankind is a history of exploitation of one person by another. Not entirely, but I'm saying it has that as an important element. I've been involved with it for over 20 years. It's not really emphasized in your textbook. Fabozzi and his co-authors talk about a lot of things in the financial world, but not about the underlying human behavior. Behavioral finance, or behavioral economics more broadly, is a kind of revolution that has occurred in finance and economics over the last 20 or 30 years. And it remains somewhat controversial. I don't quite fully understand why it is that people polarize as much as they do, but some people don't like this. Other people, I think, we're coming along to be the majority, I think. People are now regarding behavioral finance as an important element of finance. And so the real problem is that people are complex, and our financial institutions, as I've emphasized, are designed for real people, and their functioning depends on the behavior of real people. And it's not a simple, another revolution that's occurring parallel, of bigger significance, is a revolution in neuroscience about the human brain. And the human brain is a very complicated organ. And it's not, economists have liked to invoke the principle of rationality as an underlying component of their theory, and that has been useful, but it's of limited use because people aren't rational. They're often rational, they're not completely rational. And very often people behave stupidly. I'll put it that way. That includes everyone, including me, because we're human and we have limits. And that encourages, one thing about the human species is that we are aware of other people's weaknesses and have an impulse to exploit them. Okay, so when you see other people behaving stupidly, sometimes you think, maybe I can turn this to my advantage. Okay, and that becomes a problem. The history of humankind is a history of exploitation of one person by another. Not entirely, but I'm saying it has that as an important element. So I'm going to talk about these human failings. It's not to say that people are stupid. I'm just saying they're people, right? And we're all imperfect. We're smart in some dimensions, and we can be very smart, but we can also make important mistakes. But before I start, I wanted to try to put this into a perspective, because maybe I'll return to this at the end of the lecture. But I wanted to start on an upbeat note. I talk about all kinds of human errors, but I wanted to start on an upbeat note that the business world generally doesn't exploit people terribly, I believe. That very characteristically, successful businesses in finance and elsewhere consider their long-term advantage and the reputation they have. So doing something that is blatantly exploitative of human weaknesses will work against their long-term advantage. And so we don't see, you'll see a lot of human failings, but we don't see people cashing in on them as often as you'd think. And beyond that, I want to emphasize also that another aspect of human behavior is morality. Evolutionary biologists think that this evolved along with our other traits, that we have an impulse to be moral. And so in the long run, you might not really gain so much satisfaction from exploiting other people's mistakes. And so you don't necessarily do that. So that's why we'll have a lot of weaknesses outlined, and we won't see significant or serious exploitation of them as characteristic. Now, as you know, I have chapters from my forthcoming book assigned for this course, and I look back on what I put up for you to read, and I keep thinking, gee, this really wasn't ready. So I had a chapter for this section of the reading list about behavioral finance, and I thought I didn't really get it right. I know what I was trying to say, but maybe I should. What I start out in that chapter is talking about Adam Smith, okay, and his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, just to remind you, Adam Smith was a professor in Scotland. That in 1759, he was a professor of moral philosophy because there were no professors of economics in those days. And he wrote in 1759. Maybe I should write some of this on the board. He's probably the most important figure in the history of economic thought. So in 1759, he wrote his Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in 1776, he wrote the more famous book, Wealth of Nations. So this is the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Wealth of Nations is considered the first real treatise on economics, and it's a wonderful book, and it's still very readable today. His Theory of Moral Sentiments is not so widely read, but it's not really economics. It's a book about psychology and morality. And I find it very good, even 250 years later. He went through many editions on this book because he thought it was his most important work. But the book starts out about selfishness and altruism. And the real question, which he thinks defines economics, is are people really completely selfish? Sometimes it seems that way, that their presumed benevolence is just an artifice for their own benefit. But he wonders, how does an economy work if everyone is totally selfish? And he ends up concluding that they're not. I thought it was very interesting the way he put it. The thing he emphasized right at the beginning of the book is that people inherently love praise. All right? We crave the approval of other people. And so praise is a fundamental human desire. But then he reflected on it, and he said, do people really want praise itself, or is it something else that they want? And he said that, well, think of it this way. Suppose people made a big mistake and thought that you had accomplished something, but there was a mix-up. You know, it was really somebody else who did it, not you, and it's just a complete mistake. You had nothing to do with it. But you find lots of people praising you. Would that really be pleasurable? And if suppose you even know that they'll never find out that I didn't do it. Well, Smith said, it probably isn't, right? I mean, think about it. You internally are thinking, I'm getting all this praise, but I know I don't deserve it. So I don't enjoy it. And then he went on to say that, especially among people who are more mature, he says more mature people, not everyone makes this step, but he says adults, normal, mature adults, make a transition from a desire for praise to a desire for praiseworthiness. I want to know that I am the kind of person who will be praised, and I don't need to get the praise. And he said it's that tendency, ultimately, which makes an economy work, that people don't care just about praise. And he gives an example of mathematicians, and he said he's known many mathematicians in his life, and he finds that they're almost all obscure. The public doesn't know about mathematicians. They couldn't explain to the public what they do. And they don't seem to care at all, because they know the public doesn't appreciate mathematics. And so there's a few mathematician friends who understand what they do and may praise them. But ultimately, a mathematician can sometimes do the work completely unknown, you know, writing it, and it's the praiseworthiness that drives these people. So I think that you may think that I'm being too idealistic when I say this, but I think that the finance profession, this is what I was trying to say in that chapter, that the finance profession, like other mature professions, is really dominated, although there's a lot of funny things that happen, is really dominated by people who have reached this desire for praiseworthiness. And so you're not going to exploit people extravagantly, just because why would I do that? It's just not a good thing. I wouldn't feel good about it. Though some people will. Now, I wanted to also mention, not everyone reaches this mature state that Adam Smith describes. And that's one of the complexities of human society. And I think that the finance profession has a problem with other kinds of people. Now, there's a whole branch of psychology called personality psychology that categorizes people by their personality. And we're not all the same. And in our society, we have many different kinds of personalities. A successful society promotes people up who have the praiseworthiness desire. We try to recognize them, and we try to put people of character into important positions with not complete success. But I wanted to just briefly talk about, this is a lecture on psychology, and I wanted to talk about other personality types that are, and I was going to use a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition 4, published by the American Psychiatric Association. They're coming out with a 5th edition in 2014. DSM-4 is kind of a household word around my house because my wife is a psychologist. And so DSM-4 is actually controversial among psychiatrists because it's too cut and dried for some of them. What it tries to do is identify mental illnesses and personality types in a quantifiable, reproducible way so that we can define who has this mental illness or who has this personality type. And so it gives you checklists, and it says, you know, the patient must have exhibited at least 3 of the following 5 behaviors. And then there'll be another checklist. And so you keep score, and you can actually diagnose personality disorder. I'm just going to mention one. They have many personality disorders. One of them is called APD, called antisocial personality disorder. And so they have checklists, but just to give you a sense. And the antisocial personality disorder is called psychopathy, or one kind of APD is psychopathy. Another one is called sociopathy. And I don't know, there's a huge literature on these. But according to DSM-4, 3% of the male population in the world is APD, okay? And 1% of the female population. A simple definition for APD is a jerk, okay? But there are more male jerks than female jerks, apparently, according to their this is all quantifiable and done. But what is an anti-social personality disorder? It has the following characteristics: lack of remorse, frequent lying, lack of empathy, superficial charm, shallowed emotions, distorted sense of self, constant search for new sensations. Have you met someone like that? You probably have, because that's 3% of the population. I'm not anti-male when I point out there are 3 times as many jerks among males as females. Females have characteristically different personality disorders, and you can look down the list. So it's much more than 3% of the population that would be diagnosed with one or the other. So you know what an APD person is: manipulative, feigns affectionate or warm feelings but doesn't feel them, and is trying to deceive you. And I encountered one. Once a student came to my office and asked to sign up as my research assistant. And I was talking to him. I thought, well, maybe, you know, I said, come back and talk to him. Later on, I read about him in the Yale Daily News. He was an imposter student. He was not a Yale student. And he had been around to other university campuses. He was an imposter at like 3 different campuses. So there's something wrong with this person, right? Kind of made me feel. Then he came later and asked me for a recommendation letter. I couldn't believe it. After I read about him in the Yale Daily News. But this is extreme, right? And so, incidentally, someone did a study of APD by going to a prison and categorizing the inmates using DSM-4 standards, and they found that 40% of the prisoners had APD. Also, neuroscience people have found that there are differences in the prefrontal cortex that are correlated with APD. So it seems to be, it's a problem we have in our society that some people have a brain structure that's a little different, and it may make it difficult for them to behave in a good way. So we're learning more and more about neuroscience, you know, it's interesting to me that Adam Smith's book still rings true, though. There's some basic common sense that we all learn. You have to judge people, and you have to learn their character, and you have to be a person of character, for in the long run, that's what you want. It gives you what you want in life. So I'm going to talk about. I'm going to turn now to. Oh, another thing I want to say at the beginning is that people are manipulable. Unfortunately, true. And unfortunately, we live in a world where it's hard to avoid manipulating people at all, because we have a free enterprise system that encourages competition. And if the competition is manipulating people, how do you completely stay clear of that? And I think this is one of the contradictions of our society. And a very simple and obvious manipulation is they'll put a price on some item they're selling, like $9.99, all right? So you go, well, why didn't they just say $10, right? Well, you know why they didn't. It's called pricing points in marketing, because $9.99 sounds a lot less psychologically than $10. So everyone does it. Almost everyone does it. But is that bad? Well, it's bad in a way. It's manipulative, isn't it? I mean, I'm annoyed by it. Maybe you are, too. But if you were in business, would you do that, too? You might feel that you have to, and it's a harmless sort of manipulation, right? It's not hurting anyone, really. They may be buying a little bit more than they want, but you see, that's the kind of thing that that comes in. So in looking at financial institutions, they're often manipulative in that sense. But I don't think that it's similar to a politician. If you want to be a member of Congress or whatever, you can't say what you really believe, right? Because you won't get elected. You've got to kind of doctor your opinions to the public opinion, and so otherwise you won't have. But you might have a moral purpose underlying it all, because you want to get elected so you can do good things, and so you do end up saying things. So it's hard to judge people, good or bad. It's an overall sense you get of someone's character, that people are doing things that appear somewhat manipulative and somewhat bad, but you get an overall sense of the person through time, and that's and ultimately our society, within limits, rewards people that show character through all the confusing details. Now I wanted to move, that was my introduction. I wanted to move now to discussing some particular aspects of behavioral finance, or more broadly, behavioral economics, and about human failings that are exploitable by somebody, but and are somewhat exploited, but remain as. I want to start out with what's probably the most famous element of behavioral economics, this prospect theory, and it was invented by 2 psychologists, Danny or Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And in the late 20th century. They called it prospect theory because it was a theory of how people form decisions about prospects. And a prospect is a gamble. It's about people's decisions under uncertainty. And in very simple terms, the prospect theory says, now there's a huge literature on this, so I'm trying to give you a very quick description of it, that there's something called a value function, which represents how people value things. And there's a weighting function. That's the two parts, which shows how people infer or how they deal with probabilities. Okay, and I'll just show simply what the Kahneman and Tversky says. I'll draw a picture of the value function and the weighting function. And this will be very quick, and you'd have to read more. But the way people value gains or losses, let me see, how do I better draw the line in the middle. Okay, and these we're talking about financial gains. So these are gains, and this is 0, and this is losses. Well, negative. What I have on the horizontal axis is wealth or money or something like that. 0 in the middle. Okay. And then we have on this axis value, which is something like utility. I'll erase my 0. It doesn't get in the way. And what they find is that people's value has a funny shape. We don't weigh gains and losses linearly. In a positive quadrant, when we have positive gains, there's diminishing value like that. It doesn't ever slope down. It's concave down, like diminishing marginal utility in economic theory. But for losses, it looks something like this. It's concave up. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is a diagram that Kahneman and Tversky wrote in their famous Econometrica article 30 years ago. So there's diminishing marginal utility for gains, but there's the opposite. Well, we have concave up. And there's a kink. You note that the value function has a kink at the origin. So what does this mean? It means, okay, first of all, this origin is from what point do I estimate gains and losses? That's called the reference point, and it's psychological, and it's subject to manipulation. The reference point is the 0 from which I measure things. The kink, so that first of all, the reference point is probably today's wealth, but it can be something else if people are manipulated by the way something is presented to them. Framing, according to Kahneman and Tversky, is presentation. So I can give the same prospect to people, but word it in different ways that suggests a different reference point, and that will change people's behavior. So you can manipulate people by describing something in different terms, by suggesting a different reference point. But typically the reference point is today's wealth. The kink means that people are very conscious of little changes in their wealth, and they're spooked by them. I'm really afraid because my value drops very rapidly, even for a small loss. So if you were to say, lose $5 this morning, all right, you had it in your pocket and you lost it on the way to this lecture, you would feel exaggeratedly bad about that. You should really regard $5 as just nothing, because the present value of your lifetime income is in the millions, so what's $5? But you don't think that way, and so you're spooked and deterred by small losses, and less encouraged by small gains. So this kind of thing allows business people to exploit people if they want to. If people are so focused on these little changes, then you are encouraged in business to try to pick things out that people are paying attention to, like small things, and sell insurance policies on just those things. And so insurance should be concentrated on the really big things, like life insurance. You know, the fact that one of your parents could die and the children's family would be out of money for the rest of their lives. That's a big thing. But it may not work to sell that kind of insurance. You can do something that is more focused on what people are watching and make it something little so that it doesn't require them to spend so much money. The classic example of that is funeral insurance. Okay? You go around telling people, if for some reason this sales pitch works, and it's worked for thousands of years. They sold this in ancient Rome. You tell people, you know, if someone in your family dies, you could have an expense of getting a proper burial for this person. It costs money. And so they would insure that one thing, okay? And it was a little thing, so, but it works to sell that. Another example of that is airline flight insurance. Okay, you are insured for this flight on the airplane, okay? I heard an ad for funeral insurance recently. They're still doing this after 2,000 years because it still works, and it's manipulative. That's not what you should do for people. You should not pick out some little thing. They also have diamond ring insurance. After an engagement, some women will want to buy an insurance policy on the diamond because it can actually fall out of your ring and you lose it. But that's like, what is it, $5,000 something? It's not big, it's not essential. And if you're insuring that and not other things, you're making a mistake. But fortunately, the insurance industry is not too, it has come around to do things that are more, they are doing things that matter and are big. And that's because this Kahneman-Tversky value function is an it represents an error that people are prone to be making, but it's not total and not complete. And so ultimately, people don't go to insurance companies that manipulate them. It gets around, and eventually people come around to wanting something better. And so while there is some manipulation, it's limited. Now, the other aspect of Kahneman-Tversky is the weighting function. Okay, and it's, I'm going to draw again a picture of it, and it's this time. It's how people psychologically think about probabilities. And this again is Kahneman and Tversky. A probability is a number between 0 and 1, or 0 and 100%. I'll put 0 here and 1 here. We can tell someone the probability of something, but they can't accept it psychologically. The errors that people make are described by the weighting function. What the weighting function is, the psychological impact. You are behaving as if you just don't understand the probability. So what Kahneman and Tversky say is that for very low probabilities, people may round them to 0. And for very high probabilities, they may round them to 1. But if they decide not to round them to 0 or 1, they exaggerate the difference between 0 and 1. You just can't think in terms of a continuum of probabilities. So this is what the weighting function, this is the weight as a function of the probability. For low probabilities, it's 0. I'm going to maybe exaggerate it here. Then it jumps up, and it's something like this. And as it gets close to 1, it jumps up to 1 again. So you see, it's like a broken line segment. And there's been various versions of this theory, but this is the simplest version of it. So that means if you're getting on an airplane, okay, you think, well, what's the probability of this airplane crashing? Well, you know, it's probably something like 1 in 10 million, or what is it, even less than that. So most of us in our mind just say, it's 0, and I'm done. I'm not going to think about it, I'm not going to worry about it. And so we're down here, we've rounded it to 0. But some people don't round it to 0, okay? And for them, they just blow it out of all proportion in their minds, and it becomes exaggerated. So I have it here, so it looks like it's a half. So this would be 1 here. And this is about 0.4. And then ultimately, if the probability gets really high, then I'm not even going to think about it, it's 1. Okay? So, you know, it's a little bit like people, in some of the most primitive languages in the world, there's only a couple of numbers. There's 0, there's 1, maybe there's 2 or 3, and then there's no more numbers. Well, our minds are still very primitive in dealing with probabilities. So it's like there's only 3 probabilities. Can't happen, maybe, and will happen. Okay? So I think airline flight insurance is an example of trying to manipulate this personality characteristic. So it means that they'll capture all the people who exaggerate it, right? They used to have vending machines outside of airlines. The vending machines would encourage you to buy just for this flight. As you're getting, they put it right there when you're getting on the flight. And so that's when you're most nervous, if you're one of these people who's up here. And of course, most people don't buy, but they don't have to sell it to everybody. They just sell it to these people, and they charge an outrageous price. But I haven't seen these vending machines anymore. This is interesting. Economists wrote about them 30 or 40 years ago, and they used to be everywhere. And they just kind of disappeared. Do you ever see one of these? I think they're gone. Why is that? Well, somehow we get past things like that. And so it's not like Kahneman and Tversky are immutable, representing immutable errors. These are errors that you naturally happen, but you can get past it, and you end up wanting to deal with people you trust. So you see some vending machine at the airport, and you think, well, my insurance agent isn't recommending I get this. I've got some kind of insurance. So you walk past it. There's a professor in Germany at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, Gerd Gigerenzer, who has been taking on Kahneman and Tversky and saying that they're right, that people show these tendencies for errors, but I can train people out of them with no problem. Those errors, I just tell them this is an error, teach them, and they don't do it anymore. Gary Gorton just did a seminar here on errors that people make in financial. Nick Barbaras here on the SOM, and he was using Caltech students and found that and tested their ability to prevent certain kind of errors like this. And he found that even the Caltech students made these errors just horribly. We were wondering, aren't they supposed to be bright? Those are young math geniuses. But about a third of them got everything right. So I'm thinking, they're only undergraduates, right? By the time they get along, they'll eventually be trained out of these errors. But right now, they're behaving just like behavioral finance says it will. So So anyway, I think that you will find that prospect theory explains a lot of things that go on in finance, but it doesn't explain everything. And let me move on. I want to talk about, let me see, what do I, well, there's so many things to tell you about here, and I'm thinking about my time. It's a huge field, behavioral finance. Let me mention a few other things. Regret theory is a theory that is kind of related to Kahneman and Tversky. It says that people fear the pain of regret. There's an old expression, I was kicking myself because I made some bad decision. Well, that's a painful experience when you did something wrong. This is represented somewhat in the kink in the prospect theory value function. But regret theory says that there's actually a painful emotion that you're wired not to like to have made a mistake. And so then you end up designing your life around that and trying to avoid doing anything that you might regret later. And it can create problems. You may make bad decisions because you're overly worried about regret. Gambling behavior. Anthropologists have reported that gambling occurs in every human society. And so it's one of the human universals. Not that everyone does it, but in every society you'll find people that do it. I have a 1974 study. I found that 61% of US adults actually gambled at least once for money in that year. I bet it has gone up. There's more opportunities for gambling, and it's gone up. 1.1% of men are compulsive gamblers, and 0.5% of women. This is another male trait. Somehow men are more vulnerable to compulsive gambling than women, but it's only a factor of 2 to 1. But it's an addiction that happens that distorts people's thinking. And it's such an addiction that we have an organization called Gamblers Anonymous that helps people with this. It ruins people's lives. People end up getting a divorce because you can't stay with someone, married to someone who is squandering the family money. They do it. They end up sneaking around to gamble, like drinkers sneak around for the next drink. It's gambling behavior it seems to be associated psychologically with a self-image, a sense of who I am and why I'm an important and good person, a sense of competence. Most gamblers do things that they think are revealing of their competence, and they tend to pick a certain form of gambling that they become psychologically identified with, and they avoid any other form of gambling. Gambling behavior is part of what goes on in the stock market. Certain people who have a personality which makes them particularly interested in gambling find that a life in finance can give them the kind of stimulation. Gambling behavior, by the way, is almost like a drug addiction in a sense, that people who are depressed may go to a gambling casino as a way of getting themselves out of the depression. And they say that when they walk into the casino, suddenly my troubles are gone. I feel invigorated and alive. It's almost like it creates a hormonal difference in them that they seek, and it's almost like injecting yourself with something. So it's a very hard thing to conquer. I mentioned before how when the New York State in 1811 created the first corporate law that produced a lot of questionable companies, people then said, this is just gambling. It's bad. But the other side of it is that the same gambling behavior, it's not usually a pathology. It's an aspect of human sensation-seeking of various aspects of our psychology that drive us. What the stock market is, in some sense, is a way of channeling this kind of behavior into something productive instead of just a game. And so they make it very clear in the stock markets of the world, this is about business and this is productive. The same emotional patterns that created gambling behavior as a human universal underlie this is not abnormal, it's most people, underlie traits that work out well. Okay, the next major thing I wanted to talk about is overconfidence. Psychologists have found that there's a human tendency to overestimate one's own abilities. Okay, we all think, not all of us, most of us think we're above average. Some of us think we're way above average. And this tendency has been revealed in a number of experiments. I thought I would try one on you. I don't know if it will work. I'll try it on this class. If you will participate in this experiment by a show of hands. I'm going to ask you, I have 3 questions here. And I want to ask you to write down a 90% confidence interval. All right? Okay, you have a pencil to write this down. And then afterwards, I'm going to tell you the answer and see if it fell in your confidence interval. Okay, so this is what it is. What is a 90% confidence interval? It's a range of values so that you are 90% sure that the true value lies in this range. Okay? So if I asked you for what is the population of New Haven, you might say 90% confidence interval, that's between 50,000 and 150,000. That means you're 90% sure that the population falls in that range. And so you should be right 90% of the time. That if I ask you to give 90% confidence intervals, you should be right 9 times out of 10. If I ask for a 99% confidence interval, you have to widen the interval, then you should be right 99 times out of 100. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you will cooperate with me, is give 90% confidence intervals for, I have 3 questions I'm going to give you. But I have to ask you to be honest, otherwise this thing won't work. You could game me by just giving excessively wide confidence intervals, right? And then, from 0 to infinity, then you'll always be right. But you're not playing honestly. So I have to appeal to your character to do this honestly, okay? So I have 3 questions here. I just changed the questions. The first is, now what you have to write down on your note paper somewhere is your honest estimate of a 90% confidence interval. And so the first question is the world population. How many people are alive in the world? All right. As of, I think it was 8 a.m. this morning, the US Census has something called the World Population Clock. And you just go, don't cheat. Some of you have laptops. Don't do it. But after this, you can search Google on World Population Clock, and it shows you minute by minute how many people there are in the world, every birth and death. They're not actually recording them. It's a fake, but I mean, it's supposed to be an estimate. So I got the world population. So what I want you to do, can you write down a lower bound and an upper bound for the world population this morning, as measured by the US Census? Okay, can you write that down? But I don't want you to make it too wide. Remember, I only want you to be 90% sure. And I don't want you to make it too narrow, because then you're more likely to fail. So you've written that down, the world population? Okay, my next question is to the world. What does it weigh? Okay. Well, actually, it's the mass in kilograms of the world. Can you write that down? This is astronomy. Okay, let me say, I'm asking for it in kilograms, but you can do it in metric tons. That just knocks off 3 zeros. A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms, okay? And just so you'll know for sure, that's not the same thing as a long ton, which is UK. The United Kingdom uses the long ton, which is 2,240 pounds. I just looked this up, and is 1.1 metric tons. And it's not exactly the same as a short ton, which we use in the United States, which is 2,000 pounds, which is 0.98 metric tons. All right? Just tell me how many tons. That's not going to affect your 90% confidence interval, right? Just tell me how many tons does the Earth weigh? Okay? All right, and then that's the second. I have one more question. How many languages are there in the world? Okay. Now, I know, because you might complain, this is a matter of definition, because sometimes 2 dialects might be considered a separate language. Well, I'm asking you to give me the number. The World Authority on Languages is an organization that has a website called ethnologue.com. And if you go to that website, they're always discovering new language. They keep track of it. New languages keep getting discovered because some guy is hiking out in Siberia, and they go to this little village and say, hey, these people are speaking a language that had never been documented before. So it's this process of learning languages. They also keep dying out because they're just elderly people in this village, and when they die, this language is going to die with them. So anyway, the question is, I want your 90% confidence interval for the number of languages as defined by ethnologue.com. Okay, you have to guess how they define a language. But you have an idea more or less what a language is, right? It's more than a dialect, because they can still understand each other if they speak different dialects. We're talking about really different languages. Okay, have you written down 3 confidence intervals? Okay, so I'm going to write down the answers, and I hope this works. I'm trusting to your honesty in getting these things, because you could game me and make this not work. But give me your honest So I'm going to write down the correct answer. So the world population, as of 8 a.m. this morning, was 6,901,330,581. Okay. Now, can I get a show of hands? How many people's confidence interval includes that number? Okay, did someone tell me what percent that is? That is not 90%. You're doing pretty well, though. What do you think, Oliver? 80. You think it's 80? See him up again. Maybe it is 80. All right, you're doing really well. Some honest people here didn't put their hands up. Good. All right, well, that's one. So we did 80 instead of 90. What about the weight of the Earth? Okay, in kilograms. Well, it's 5.974 times 10 to the 24th power. And I'll give you that in tons, in more familiar. It's 5,974 billion tons. Okay, you got that? I meant to do some calculation. That'd be 5.9734 times 10 to the 18th power. Okay, can we do a show of how many people had a number in, how many people are in the confidence interval there? All right, Oliver, what do you think? What's the fraction? 10%. Okay, so this one, you did really well on world population. 80, And the last one, how many languages are in the world? Well, according to ethnologue.com, there are 6,909 languages this morning. Okay, how many people got that within their confidence interval? Okay, what do you think, Oliver? 10%. Okay, why did you do so much better on world population? Well, thank you for being honest with me. I think it worked once again. The overconfident. So why is it that people are overconfident like this? And psychologists have tried to describe what it is that goes on in people's minds that produces answers like this. Well, one of them is that people seem to have a sense that they understand the world more than they really do. It's an illusion. Actually, the world is just infinitely complicated, and there are so many surprises. You have when you think about a question like this, there's many different perspectives that you can take. And if you thought more about it, your imagination might help you to widen your confidence interval, but you can't think of all the perspectives at once. And so you tend to gravitate to the first one that comes to mind, and it gives you an underestimate of the confidence of the. So that is overconfidence. By the way, I think it's a little bit higher in males than females. I didn't do a separate male-female count. But females are definitely overconfident. That's a so-called macho personality that's supremely overconfident, that's not in DSM-4, but I don't think it is, but it is more common among males. But it's really everyone is overconfident, so it's not, there's no important sex difference here. But incidentally, I think that overconfidence, and this is an important phenomenon, it goes beyond yourself. It extends to your friends. And you exaggerate. There's a tendency for people to think that I have very smart friends. Okay, I was reflecting the other day when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. I was in the honors program, and we thought we were pretty smart. And I had a number of young people that I just imagined were heading toward careers, really great careers. There was one student that we called Young Jack Kennedy. But, this was some years ago. Jack Kennedy was president of the United States. We thought he was a genius. That was probably wrong too, right? None of these people are geniuses. I was thinking that most of my friends ended up in very, good careers, but nothing that you would think was spectacular. I had one friend as an undergrad who I thought was a genius, and his name was Bruce Wasserstein. Anyone ever heard of him? Maybe not. Well, see, that's it. But he founded his own investment bank called Wasserstein Perella, became really rich, and then he bought interest in Lazard Frères, the French investment bank. And he was a real big shot on Wall Street. I met him again about 10 years ago, and then he died. God, he had a heart attack. And died. So I know his whole life. I saw him when he was 18, and I've watched his whole life, and it's now history. It's kind of scary, but I remember thinking he was a genius as an undergrad. But I was wondering, what was wrong with my judgment? Why did I see so many other geniuses? And he maybe, I thought now that I think back on it, he had a sort of real-world common sense that amazed me. He just knew things that, it wasn't fake knowledge. He seemed to know how things worked. So I guess I was right about one of them. But not enough that none of you have heard of him, right? Anyway, he has an investment bank named after him, right? You should have heard of him, but maybe not. But anyway, this thing affects people's thinking too. I think that we tend to think that the head of state who's running, the head of our central bank is a genius. And this really clouds our thinking. It's not just confident. It's like our ego extends to the other people that we associate with ourselves. Now, the head of a central bank in another country we have no respect for. It's only in our own country, because it's part of our ego involvement that produces this overconfidence. So this produces this tendency for overconfidence produces a lot of anomalies and opportunities for manipulation. So for example, Rakesh Khurana, who is a professor at the Harvard Business School, has written a book called Search for the Charismatic CEO. And he claims that there's a tendency for people to think that CEOs are geniuses, or at least the one that we found is a genius. And companies then seek out a genius CEO to put in charge of the company as a kind of manipulation of the stock market. They think if we got some guy who's run other companies successfully in the past, he must be a genius. Put him in our company, our stock price will go up. Then we can sell our we can exercise our options and make a lot of money by putting in this fake genius. And Khurana says, well, there are some people who are maybe geniuses at management, but most of the time they're just lucky. And we tend to develop overconfidence. And then what happens, according to Khurana, is you put in some guy who turned around some company spectacularly, supposedly. You bring him in to run a new company, and he doesn't know anything about this new company, right? But he has to justify himself. So he lays off a lot of people and shuffles things around and just destroys everything in the company and ruins things. This is related to another author that I recommend. I mentioned him before, I think. Nassim Taleb wrote a book called Fooled by Randomness. That he's Lebanese, but now in the U.S. Nassim Taleb, Fooled by Randomness, that says that most of the things that happen in life are just chance. And we tend to ascribe them. If they happen to us, we're very quick to conclude that it's a sign of our own genius. And if it happens to someone that is a friend of us, then you think, well, I have genius friends. Isn't that nice? And so it leads to mistakes. Okay, let me go to another, how much time do I have? Cognitive dissonance. This is another psychological principle. The term was coined by sociologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s, I believe. I actually met this guy. That's the nice thing about being in academia. You meet all these great names if you're in long enough eventually. But what is cognitive dissonance? It's a judgmental bias that people tend to make because they don't want to admit they're wrong. Maybe I'm oversimplifying this thing. It's painful to think that I believed something and it was wrong. So people will cling to old beliefs and try to find evidence that supports their belief because they have an ego involvement with the belief. And so I will be biased. The famous experiment indicating cognitive dissonance done by some psychologists had the following form. They got a list of people who had just bought a car, and they knew what make of car. They got the list from car dealers, so they knew exactly what car they had just bought. And they called these people up and asked them to participate in a psych experiment, or I think they said a marketing experiment, but they didn't let them know that they knew what car they had just bought. And then the experiment was the following. Let's go through a number of, what magazines do you read? And they said, let's get these out. They got all the magazines that were on the newsstand. And they said, let's look through page by page and tell us which ads you remember reading. And what they found is that people read the ads for the car they just bought, okay? And they avoided, especially, the car that they thought they might buy but decided not to buy. So after you buy a car, you want to confirm your belief in it. So you selectively get information that confirms your belief. And so this cognitive dissonance is another factor. It's been demonstrated. It's an error that people make. It doesn't mean that people, again, none of these errors is inviolable. People will make the error, and then they'll learn from their mistakes, and they'll correct it. They're not totally cognitive dissonant, but it's just a kind of error that keeps coming up. So I'll give you a couple of examples of cognitive dissonance and its effects on finance. So Will Getzman is a professor here at the Yale School of Management, and a couple of his co-authors found that mutual fund investors, when a mutual fund does very badly in its investment performance, many or most investors sell the stock and get out of it, but some of them hang on. And they thought that that was due perhaps to cognitive dissonance, because I bought this fund, I don't want to sell because I was right. So what they did is they interviewed these people, and they found out that these people didn't even know how badly the fund has done. They had blocked it out, and they had an exaggerated impression, an exaggerated impression of the success, which is characteristic of cognitive dissonance. You just forget the evidence that's contrary to your theory, and you keep assembling evidence that supports your theory. I have another example of cognitive dissonance, and this one was produced by a Professor Sendil Mullainathan at the Harvard Economics Department. And Mullainathan looked at financial advisors and his co-authors. What they did to study, that's a whole big profession. I remember at the beginning I pointed out how many hundreds of thousands of financial advisors there are. What they did, it's an interesting experiment. They hired actors to go to financial advisors and ask for their help. And the experiment was the following. They would say the same thing to each financial advisor, but the different actors would present their existing portfolio differently. In other words, you'd go to the advisor and you'd say, I have a portfolio of investments, and I'm almost entirely in money market funds. That's all. You just say that. You wouldn't express any opinion at all. Another actor would go and say, I've got all of my portfolio in tech stocks, right? Or I've got all of my portfolio in options. Now, what should advisors tell people? Well, if they were acting really professionally, they should question the assumptions that made the actor supposedly put all of their money in one kind of investment. And many of the financial advisors did, but usually they didn't. They didn't question the actor. They assumed that the actor was who had put supposedly all of the investments in money market funds was someone who was very risk averse or thought that was the right thing to do, and they didn't want to challenge them. So they would walk out of there with maybe a slightly different mix of money market funds. And somebody else who was in a very risky portfolio, they didn't challenge them. And they even sent actors in with almost all of their portfolio in their own company's stock. All right. Now, if you work for Ford Motor Company, I know this is my uncle. I had conversations with him about this, who worked for Ford Motor Company and put all of his life savings in Ford Motor Company. And I said, Uncle Ralph, you shouldn't do that, because it's your job and all of your life savings. What if something happened to Ford Motor Company? Fortunately, he didn't work for GM. which became worthless recently. But it can happen. You know, Ford could be completely wiped out. That's your life savings. And you know what he said to me? He said, you know, I worked at Ford all my life. They treat me well. I believe in them. I'm not going to sell. And so there's lots of people like that. So when they show up at a financial advisor, the first thing that they should do, the financial advisor should tell them, get out of your Ford style. You can't, that's just too risky. But only 40% of the financial advisors did that. The 60% left them mostly in their own company stock. Why did they do that? Well, Mullinathon thought it's because the advisors know there's cognitive dissonance, and they're afraid to drive away a new client. Maybe they'll gradually do it over a while, but you just don't challenge their deep beliefs. Whatever they say is true. And so they're kind of yes men. Not all of them, and maybe they'll come around. It relates then again to a moral dilemma. If you are a financial advisor working in private practice, what do you do with people who come to you if you know from experience that challenging their deep-seated beliefs will drive them away? So in the real world, this is, again, I'm not sure that these financial advisors are doing the wrong thing. If they would eventually tilt them toward a more responsible portfolio, they can't drive them away. So let me, I have so many. Let me list some of the others and move on. What else should I talk about? Anchoring. Anchoring is a principle that people, anchoring refers to a tendency to anchor your opinions on something that captures your attention. The famous anchoring experiment by, it was again Kahneman and Tversky. They asked, I could almost do this experiment here in class with you if I had a wheel of fortune. A wheel of fortune is like on a game show. You spin the wheel, and it comes up with a number between 0 and 100 in this particular wheel of fortune. So this is the experiment. They asked their subjects, how many people, it had to be something that had an answer from 0 to 100. One of their questions was, how many nations in the world belong to the United Nations? Okay? So they asked the question, they said, don't answer me just yet. Think about that question. What percent of nations in the world belong to the United Nations? Then they spun the wheel, and it came up and it showed a random number. And then they asked people for the answer. Well, it turns out that people tended to give an answer close to the number that just came up on the wheel. This is totally irrational, right? That wheel has nothing to do with the answer, and yet people were influenced by it. So then they would follow up and ask them, hey, that number you gave is the same as that just came up on the wheel, or it's close to it. Why did you do that? The guy would say, just coincidence. I wasn't influenced by the wheel. Of course not. But you know they were, because statistically they proved that they were. So anchoring means that people are attracted to, they're affected by subconscious things that, I shouldn't say subconscious. They didn't make a logical connection. When you face real ambiguity and you don't know the answer, you've got to come up with a decision. You are swayed by the most silly and random things. There's a representativeness heuristic. This is also Kahneman and Tversky. And that is that people overemphasize certain patterns that they think are representative of what they've seen before. So for example, certain patterns in the stock market that may be very rare and unusual, but if they remember it, if it somehow attracted their attention, they begin to look for that pattern again and again, and they see it too often. So for example, head and shoulders, we talked about that McGee the technical analyst, he saw the head and shoulders pattern in the stock market, and he saw that it crashed after that. But actually, it's pretty hard to find those. They're kind of rare, and it's not the right way to process data to be looking for patterns that are representative. And it invites manipulation. So I'll give you some other bad behavior. If people believe in the head and shoulders, if they believe that the head and shoulders pattern of stock price movements predicts a decline, here's what I can do. I'll take some thinly traded stock, I'll get a friend, we'll trade back and forth, and we'll influence the price to we'll deliberately create a head and shoulders pattern, okay? And then we'll short the stock massively, right at the time when the head and shoulders pattern would give a sell signal, right? We can make tons of money doing that. Right? So why don't we do that? Well, we don't, because it's a manipulation. Is this thing off? The battery just died. I'll talk loud. I'm coming to the end. Can you hear me through louder talking? I want to then just conclude with social contagion, because it's so important. This is my last, and this is really social psychology. I'm running out of room here. That's social contagion. Social psychology reflects on the fact that people are interdependent, and what I think is affected by what others think. There's something called herd behavior. That's a popular term. It refers to the tendency for people to move with the herd. Not consciously. They don't think that they're moving with the herd. I might bring up a little sociology here, and I'll use a term. Everything has been psychology, but the great sociologist, one of the founders of the discipline of sociology, was the French scholar Émile Durkheim. At the late 19th, early 20th century. And he used the word collective consciousness. And that is that our opinions about what's happening are formed by a collective understanding of what's going on. We think of ourselves, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as rational and common sense. All of our views come from common sense processing of facts. I have a sense of belief about what goes on in the world, but I underappreciate the extent to which my views are a little bit arbitrary and shared by millions of other people. You live at a certain point in time in history, and there are certain kinds of facts and ideas and anecdotes that are circulating. Another term is there's a zeitgeist. That's German, but it's now English. That means spirit of the times. So what Durkheim and other sociologists allowed us to understand is that the zeitgeist is determined by a collective memory, a collective set of facts that we operate on. This herd behavior creates big swings in the stock market and other things. So it has huge financial impact. Anyway, I've listed a number of behavioral finance principles that really come from psychology. And I've talked about some tests or examples of their proof of their importance in psychology, but in finance. But what do we conclude from this? I think that my conclusion is that we are evolving toward better and better financial institutions. There is a lot of manipulation and exploitation, but we as a society have outlawed a lot of things. For example, I mentioned that doing a stock market manipulation trick to create a head and shoulders pattern, that is an offense. Get you in jail for doing that. And we prosecute that now. So you can't do that. I'm going to talk more about this in the next lecture about regulation. But it's also people's moral judgments that the people who evolve to become important in finance are people who have an internal compass, that a desire for praiseworthiness that eliminates I'm going to give just two examples of some recent articles about this. In the current issue of the Harvard Business Review, that I assume is still on newsstands. This is Harvard Business Review. There's an article by Michael Porter and co-author Mark Kramer. Porter is a well-known professor at Harvard, in which he argues that we're coming to realize more and more about a principle he calls it shared value, or they call it shared value. And that is that the manager of a company is not going to be, shouldn't be underestimating the importance of shared value creation with society, with other people. That is, we're all in this together, and if we're mature, we recognize, for example, that I don't want to be exploitative. I don't want to make the local people in my town upset with our company. I don't want our labor force to become disenchanted. Now, what he's saying is not really about morals exactly. It's more about long-term value, but I guess morals somehow creeps into the same judgment. That mature business people see shared value, and that there was maybe not enough emphasis on it. There was too much financial theory was leading us too much toward thinking that a manager should be selfishly pursuing a narrow focus, like maximizing the short-run value of their shares. Anyway, the other example I have, which is also recent, not quite as recent as that, is a book that came out last year by Anna Bernasek, who is actually a journalist, not an academic. But it's called The Economics of Integrity. Is that the title exactly? Yes, right. Economics of Integrity. And that means, what her point in that book is that a sense of personal integrity has dominated what people do in the business world much more than we thought recently. There has been too much disregard of the fact that people do things because they're right. But she gives an example in the book, and I'll close with this concept. She said, let's consider milk, okay? Now, you drink milk regularly, I hope. It's good for you. But it could poison you. People used to get sick from drinking contaminated milk. And you don't ever hear of anyone getting sick. So she said, why is that? Well, we have government regulation of milk production. And there are laws about purity of milk. But when she looked into it and found that actually she didn't think it was mostly the regulation. She thought that you are safe drinking milk because of the integrity of our people, mostly. That if you go to some milk company and talk to the employees, they may not generally even know about the regulations. But if you ask them, they'll tell you, are you careful to keep this milk clean? They'll tell you, well, someone's going to drink this, so obviously it's common sense, I'll keep it clean. And what she says, it's not primarily the regulation, it's the integrity of the people that makes the economic system work as well as it has. So anyway, I've emphasized both sides. I've talked about human failings and about people exploiting these failings, about people with antisocial personalities. But we have a system that somehow eliminates this from being the major factor in our markets. behavior. So this is a continuation of my previous lecture in a sense, which was about behavioral finance and about human foibles. But now I want to go on to talk about what we do about some of these things, and that means talk about regulation. So I think that a regulation of finance, financial markets, and institutions is substantially directed at dealing with psychological problems and the tendency for some people to exploit human weaknesses and manipulate and take money from other people rather than help them. But I think regulation goes beyond this because it also has another more technical side, and that's about making sure that the financial system works well. For example, regulation deals with monopolies and externalities. It's been talked about a great deal that regulation has to take account of the, why don't I write this down, the too big to fail problem, that as regulation deals with systemic problems. Too big to fail refers to a phenomenon that's been observed many times in many countries, that whenever a big firm fails, the government bails it out. And that's because they realize that if this firm, especially if it's a financial firm, collapses, it will bring down the whole system with it. So that means big firms have an implicit government guarantee. Small firms don't. This is not the way anyone wanted it to be, but it happens naturally because big firms are the only ones that can bring the whole system down. So this tendency then creates an opportunity for big firms to take more risks than small firms because they know that they have this free insurance policy from the taxpayers, and so they take bigger risks and they bring on systemic crises. So dealing with this is another aspect of regulation, and it's central to regulation right now in the wake of the world financial crisis. Another term I wanted to emphasize, well, a pair of terms. There's two kinds of regulation. It's called microprudential. I think this is a relatively new word. At least it's become popular since the financial crisis of the 2000s. And macroprudential. So microprudential, prudential sort of means regulation, or dealing with prudent standards for business. Microprudential regulation protects the small firms, the small people, the individuals. Macroprudential protects the system. So macroprudential regulation deals with the too big to fail problem, and it deals with other problems that affect the whole system. I think the history of regulation involved both of these, but I think the mix was more microprudential than macroprudential until recently. So we'll talk about both of these here. So I thought I should say just something first about regulation and regulators. I'll start with an analogy. I think regulators are analogous to the referees at a sports event. Okay? They enforce rules. They decide when someone has broken the rules, and they can punish people who fail to adhere to the rules. But I think that's a good analogy because I think we generally all appreciate the importance of referees at sports events. The players often argue with the referees, but the players want them because it wouldn't be a very good game if we didn't have a referee, right? Because for example, dangerous play or play that risks others being hurt or deliberate hurting of other players would become almost necessary in order to succeed in the game. So this reflects a problem. In a competitive system, there's kind of a race to the bottom, right? If everyone else is doing something that you think is shady, well, you kind of have to do it too, or you can't compete. And so that means people in the sports world or the business world will themselves ask for regulation, or they'll try to do it themselves as much as they can. Just as children, when they play on a empty lot, when there's no adults around, will agree on some rules, and maybe they have a referee, I don't know, usually not, but they're all referees, they're all enforcing the rules. That's what we're talking about when we talk about regulation. We tend to admire the players more than the regulators. This is true both in sports and in finance. But one thing I'd like to also say is that we should show respect for regulators and referees. It's a profession, and they're not losers, as some people say. It's true the referees in a sports game probably couldn't play the game very well. They're probably too old to play it very well. But even so, they have a different profession, right? And some of them are very good at what they do. They don't attract as much attention, except when they make mistakes. It's the same thing with the regulators that I've met seem to me often to be well-meaning, intelligent people, and I think it's a career that you should consider. So when I say I'm hoping that this class prepares you for a job in finance, I'm including in that the job as a regulator. Some people like it better. because it adheres more to their personal sense of morality and integrity. They would rather be enforcing good rules of financial behavior than being compromised. Now, people, I think maybe it's a different personality. When you're in the game, I mentioned this last time, you get compromised one way or another. There's no avoiding that because you got to kind of play to the rules, right? And if the rules allow something that is questionable, you may have to do that too. You might try. I think you should try not to, but reality is something that interposes. So some people will spend years on Wall Street making money, and they'll switch to a regulator job. And it isn't because they failed on Wall Street. I think it's because life offers many different kinds of rewards. Anyway, in this lecture, I wanted to talk about, I have 5 levels of regulation that I want to talk about. So the first one is the lowest level. It's within the firm. And maybe people don't always talk about that as regulation, but I'm going to count that. Firms set up their own rules. There's no government involved. This is just internal. Then there's trade groups, all right, where a group of firms will get together and form a trade organization or a self-regulatory organization, and they will decide on rules among them that will. Then there's local government. That would be at the city or province or state level. And then there's national, and you can see where I'm heading to international. So those are the 5 kinds of regulation. And I think that the oldest are the ones at the top of the group, and as time moves on, we're becoming more and more broad in geographical scope. So I'm preserving international regulation for the end of this lecture. So let me start with number 1, which is the within firm regulation. And I thought I would start by we've talked about this before, about the modern corporation as having a board of directors. And they could be called the board of regulators. Nobody calls them that, but I think that they look a lot like regulators, but they're not imposed by the government. Remember I said that a team playing a sport wants a referee. So companies want somebody imposing some kind of standards on them as a group. So companies have boards of directors. Now, in most companies, they have both inside directors who work for the firm, and they have outside directors who have nothing to do with the firm, except that they're on the board of directors. I think that it's really the outside directors that make the board of directors into a sort of regulator. In the last lecture, I emphasized, I was talking about how people are different, and some people show more character than others. That's a problem, a fundamental problem in human society. A lot of the people who rank very low on character end up in jail, unfortunately. But most of the time, we don't want them in jail, but we can't put them in positions of responsibility. So society finds some way of kind of quarantining them so that they don't. I mean, these are all uncomfortable problems. I don't know, I can't get into all of the issues here, but we don't want them running a company. We want people of character running a company. And so in a sense, a board of directors imposes that. You put people on the board who have reputations as people of high-minded people. That's the way it should work, and I think the way it usually does work. People, high-minded people who you'd probably not want to propose some shady deal to. So you want to have regular meetings of these, and where you talk about what the company is doing. And these people impose a kind of community standard on what the company is doing. And it also has an effect on the standing of the company in the community, because they see the names on the board of directors, and they think, well, this company can't be shady, right, with these people on the board. When you join a board of directors, you're merging your reputation with the reputation of the company. So you wouldn't do it if the company looked shady. So I'll give you an example of a board of directors. I'll use our own most familiar example, the board of directors of Yale University. And it's called the President and Fellows of Yale College. And they meet regularly. They come to campus and have their meetings. But it's a small group of, I don't know what the whole number is, like 20 people. I'll give you some examples of the members of the Yale, they also call it the Yale Corporation. Richard Levin, the president of the university, of course, is chairman of the board. The governor of Connecticut, Dan Malloy, has always been, going back hundreds of years, on the Yale Corporation. So we have the governor of the state. I'll just give you several more examples. Fareed Zakaria, who was born in Mumbai, India. He's now editor of Time magazine, and he's the author of many intellectual books, and he has kind of an intellectual television show, public TV, and is a Yale alumnus. So he's on the board. We also have Indra, maybe I should write these names sometime. So they're hard to spell. Farid Zakaria. I mentioned, and then Indra Nui. That one you might have trouble spelling. She was not, I don't think she went to Yale. She was educated in India. But she's president of PepsiCo. It's a big international corporation. She's a director at the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts in New York. And this is an example of interlocking directorship. So you judge a director partly by what other boards they sit on. And she's chairperson of the U.S.-India Business Council. And I have one more example who's on the Yale Corporation. Mimi Gardner Gates. You know who she is? She's Bill Gates' stepmother, but maybe that's not the way to introduce her. I just found out that Bill Gates' mother died in 1994 and his father remarried to a woman who ran the it was an Seattle Art Gallery. So she's an art conservator. All these people are people who have reputations as high-minded intellectuals and members of our community. I don't know that Yale is in strong need of a board of directors like that. I think we would function like an orchestra without a conductor. We could do all right, but it imposes on any corporation a sort of regulatory standard that is important. So a board of directors has a really important function because let's move away from the nonprofit. Yale is a nonprofit organization. Let's consider someone doing business, a for-profit corporation. There are way too many opportunities for sleazy behavior, and you only are willing to invest in a company if the sleazy behavior is somehow under control. So I'm going to talk about maybe the most important kind of sleazy behavior in a company. It's called tunneling. Tunneling is sneaking away with value, putting it in your own pocket if you work for a company, rather than in the stockholders. The stockholders own the company, they're supposed to get the money. But the employees have never met the stockholders, and they sometimes think, you know, there's a lot of things we can do, let's do them. And the money is going to come from the stockholders and it's going to somehow end up in our pockets. So I'll give you just examples of tunneling. The company has some asset and it's going to sell it, right? So asset sales. In part of doing business, how does a company make sure that it gets a good price? Well, if you work for a company and you're in charge of the asset sale, you can tunnel. You say, I'll sell it to my brother-in-law at a really low price, all right? He'll wait a while and then he'll pay me off later, okay? That's hard to detect, because how do you know if you were a stockholder? How are you going to find out? That's stealing from the company, right? If you sell it at a non-market price. How does somebody know that? I mean, they can't be the stockholders can't be looking at every deal. So I'll give you another example. Contracts. The company is signing a contract to provide something to them regularly. They can pay too much. Now, it could be your brother-in-law who's running, but hey, let's not be so obvious about it. It'll just be some guy that I met, and we're both antisocial personalities. We've just discovered each other, and you know, it doesn't even have to be written down. I'll give this contract to you over somebody else, and I'll pay you too much. And you know, sometime later you take care of me. You know, I did it for you. You return the favor. This is tunneling. Another one: executive compensation. The CEO decides to pay his friends in the company, his cronies, very high salaries. And he would defend it if anyone asked, but these people are they're worth every penny. You know, who knows what somebody is worth? Who's going to judge that? Expropriation of corporate opportunities. See, one of the most valuable things about a company is that you're in the business and you know what's happening, right? And your company is producing a certain kind of product. Then someone comes along and says, you know, I don't really want your product, but you seem like the kind of people who could produce something that I really need, something else. And so you as a director, as a president of a company, you should say, okay, we can do it. But you don't do that. Instead, you say, I'm setting up a new company with my name. Or my brother-in-law is setting up a new company. And you tell him all the corporate secrets and how he can do it. Okay? That's tunneling, again. And of course, there's insider trading. That's when people in the company will buy or sell their own shares based on knowledge that they have, that they haven't told the public yet. So if you know that the company is going to collapse, you sell your shares right away. If you know the company has some great news, you buy them before you announce it. That's tunneling, again, because you're taking money out of the company because of the opportunities you have as part of the management of the company. You see how many different ways, and I haven't listed them all. There's many, many ways. Companies do so many things. So why would you ever invest in a company? You might think there's a million ways to get money out of the company, and the people who are running it don't know me. They don't care about me. That's why a corporation is kind of a delicate thing. To work at all, it has to have some way of controlling all these things, and there's so many of them, and they're so complex. I would say that's why we have boards of directors and why we put people of known reputations on boards of directors. So this is maybe the most essential kind of regulation, and it's within firm. So if you ever, and you may someday be serving on a board, the thing you have to remember is that a board member has, if you ever agree to serve on a board, I think you should interpret it as a moral obligation that you have taken on to prevent all of these things, okay, and to make sure that the business is run in a high-minded way. And remember that your reputation is at stake because you're part of the company. But it's more than that. It's a moral duty. So you have what's called the duty of care as a board member. Duty of care is a duty to act as a reasonable, prudent, rational person would. That means you have to make sure that you're getting the information, you're watching, you're being careful about your obligation as a board member. You are not managing the company. You are watching the management of the company. And you don't follow every detail, but you have to follow enough that you act as a sort of regulator, and you have to know what you're doing. You also have a duty of loyalty. And that's usually interpreted as loyalty to the shareholders. I would say it's expanding. Now, there's more and more talk of corporate social responsibility and the loyalties that you have to other people, members of the community at large. But I'd say that let's just start from the beginning. Because there's so much temptation to steal money, to tunnel money out of corporations, it probably remains true that your main duty of loyalty is to the actual shareholders, because they're the ones who put up the money and they're expecting to get a profit back. So if you ever serve on the board of directors, I think you may become, it may seem, many board members don't view it as a very significant thing. They think, well, this is just an honor to be on a board, and I just show up at 4 meetings a year, and we listen to a presentation from the CEO, and we say, fine. But that's not what you should be doing. I think one has to kind of notice the ambiance. You have to use your intuitive judgment as a board member about is this a up and up firm? Is there a good atmosphere here? Anyway, I wanted to move up. So that was my first thing at the firm level. Of course, firms have compliance departments they issue rules, they issue statements of purpose, and that's all within firm. But I wanted to move up now another step in my regulatory thing and move to trade groups. And these are groups of firms that get together to form an organization. Well, what did I say? Indra Nooyi was on the U.S.-India, what was that? I don't remember the exact name. It sounds like a trade group, a private group that deals with businesses in both U.S.-India Business Council. So apparently business people in both countries got together and formed an organization where they discuss issues. And there may be a regulatory function associated with them. But I wanted to start with an example of a trade group, and that is the New York Stock Exchange, because it's important in history, and it was founded in 1792. In 1792, stockbrokers functioned. We had a stock market in the United States. Of course, it was a small one. The big stock markets then were in Europe. But there was no organization for the U.S. stock market. We had our first stock market crash in 1792, the first American stock market crash. And within 2 months, the stockbrokers set up a trade organization called the New York Stock Exchange. And they met outdoors under a buttonwood tree. So they signed a document called the Buttonwood Agreement. Stockbrokers used to work outdoors. This is even into the 20th century, the so-called American Stock Exchange used to be called the Curb Exchange. That's because they were guys who would stand on the curb outside of the New York Stock Exchange, which had a building, and they would just dicker among themselves and trade. Then they decided they better get a building, and that became the American Stock Exchange, which doesn't exist anymore. It was absorbed by the New York Stock Exchange eventually. But anyway, the stockbrokers in New York got together under the Buttonwood tree and signed a historic agreement setting up the stock exchange. And it's been described as an idealistic document about our duties and our ethics. But I found actually the text of the Buttonwood Agreement, and it's really short. So I will read it to you. I'll read you the whole Buttonwood Agreement. We, the subscribers, brokers for the purchase and sale of the public stock, do hereby solemnly promise and pledge ourselves to each other that we will not buy or sell from this day for any person whatsoever any kind of public stock at less than 1/4% commission on the specie value of gold, that we will give preference to each other in our negotiations, period. In testimony, we have set our hands this day, 17th day of May, 1792 in New York. That's the whole Buttonwood Agreement. It sounds like a price-fixing agreement, doesn't it? And excluding other traders, so it sounds like a cartel. I was wondering how I got the impression that the Buttonwood Agreement was so idealistic. Where's the idealism there? So I went and I looked on the New York Stock Exchange website, and this is their interpretation. It's on the website right now, of the Buttonwood Agreement. It says there, at the heart of the Buttonwood Agreement was the need for fairness, responsibility, and trust. Okay, so I think actually that might not be as outrageous a self-serving claim as you might think, because what had happened in the 1792 stock market crash, there was one person who figured very heavily in it. His name was William Durr. Am I spelling that right? It's E. No, it's U-E. Maybe that was a U umlaut. William Durr, who was a stock promoter, and he got a lot of people to manage their money for him, and he got buying stocks on margin, encouraged a lot of people to buy stocks on margin, and it created a bubble in the stock market, pushing prices up. Other people thought that Mr. Durr was not a good character, but he managed to create a bubble in the market, and it eventually collapsed. So it was within 2 months of that. Obviously, the stock exchange was created in response to Mr. Durr. And so what they're basically saying is, we won't do business with this guy because we'll close him out. If we all agree that we won't trade with him, or people like that, then they'll be out of the business. The other thing is putting a minimum commission on sale. This is the profit they get from the sale. It makes it in kind of a gentleman's organization, because they chose a commission which was sufficiently high that they could make substantial money trading stock. And I think the philosophy was, we are ethical members of the community. We don't want this business to be turned over to discount brokers who don't care, and we will exercise a duty of care. I wish it said that in the agreement. I'm reading between the lines here. I think that probably was part of the motivation. And so we have to keep our incomes up so that good people can stay in the business. That was the philosophy. And then later, the New York Stock Exchange adopted many rules about ethical trading. And so they were imposing standards. It was just not explicit in the original Buttonwood Agreement. But so things changed recently. Our attitude toward cartels has changed over the years. And there's a couple of important dates I wanted to emphasize. One of them is 1975, and it's May Day. The May Day was May 1st, 1975. In the United States, the government, under the Securities and Exchange Commission, made fixed commissions illegal. Until 1975, the New York Stock Exchange was still following something like their 1792 rule. Anyone who was a member of the New York Stock Exchange had to impose a minimum commission. And then secondly, they could only trade with each other, closing everybody else out. Now, they could justify that because they're closing out the scoundrels. And so that prevents a race to the bottom. But it had another effect. It was creating monopoly profits. And eventually, the Securities and Exchange Commission said, no more. We're going to have competitive commissions. Any effort to fix commissions in a trade group is now illegal. In 75. I think it's interesting, by the way, that the chairman, this is a local interest, the chairman of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, in 75 was Ray Garrett, a Yale College graduate, and the president of the United States was Gerald Ford, a Yale Law School graduate. So this had a local beginning. But I can't claim, I wasn't lecturing about finance in those days. Incidentally, that also is 1975 is the beginning of the national market system, which Congress created. So that this idea that you only trade with other New York Stock Exchange brokers was ended. Now brokers have an obligation to find the best price for their customers on any exchange. Okay? So what the government really did is it broke the monopoly. And that's why the New York Stock Exchange has faltered since. There's so many competitors now. You've got all these discount brokers. So it hasn't done as well as, if they hadn't made these changes in 75, it wouldn't have done as well. Right now it's about to be taken over by the Deutsche Börse, the German stock exchange. So that's still on, I think, right, that deal? So substantially it was a cartel. In the United Kingdom, it took a little longer, but in 1986, when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, they had what's called the Big Bang. That's the British counterpart to May Day. They deregulated commissions. And again, it had the same effect. It broke the monopoly. So I could go on a lot about trade groups, but I think we see some idea that, incidentally, the New York Stock Exchange, even today, has its own market surveillance unit that looks, it goes through trading records, and it looks for examples of, say, manipulation. And they will track down and find you if they think that something immoral was done. So that even though they had a deregulation of their commissions, they still are doing that. You know, this idea about allowing groups to regulate prices is controversial. Airlines used to have their fares regulated by the what's the U.S. government agency? The airline fares were regulated at high levels, and in those days, airplanes would give you great service because they were competing on service rather than on fares. So it used to be that when you got on an airplane, there were a lot of empty seats because they were scheduling many more flights than needed, and you got great meals, but it was expensive. And so if they deregulate, fares come way down. Services, now you're jammed in shoulder to shoulder, and if you don't like that, you can pay more, but very few people will pay more. So I think on balance it's a good thing to deregulate commissions. And now we have all these websites now that sell on very low commissions. It's a product of deregulation. A product of regulation, regulation that prevents the cartels from forming and closing out competitors who might charge a lower rate. So the third thing I said about local regulation, this is my third category. It used to be that it was a more local phenomenon. I'm particularly thinking of the United States, but I think it was true elsewhere as well. Local banks would be regulated locally by the people who saw them rather than a distant national government. In the United States, until the 1930s, financial regulation was almost exclusively local. The federal government didn't do anything. So we had a bunch of laws called blue sky laws that were put in place by state governments during the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was from the 1890s to the 1920s. That was an era in U.S. history when a lot of state governments started adding regulations. They did other things like regulate food safety and other business laws. But regarding finance, it was the blue sky laws. Now, I don't know if anyone remembers why they're called blue sky laws, but one interpretation is that there were a lot of salespeople for investments. And some of them would give you an exaggerated sales job on it. They would say, there's no limit to how high the price can go of this stock, nothing but the blue sky above. So that's my story about how they got to be called blue sky laws, but I don't know if there's any agreement on where that name came from. But what state governments started to do, and I think the first blue sky law was in the state of Kansas in 1911. It was given some impetus by a book written by William Brandeis called Other People's Money in 1914, I think it was. That was a book that detailed the scandals of fake securities or dishonest promoters of securities. So it started in Kansas in 1911, but by the 1930s, practically every state had blue sky laws, and they had state regulators that enforced them. But the problem was that they were state laws, and it made it difficult for state governments. There's all these different state governments are trying to regulate an industry which is really national or international in scope. So people could evade the blue sky laws. Now, especially since the telephone became prominent in the 1920s, you could set up a boiler room, so-called, in one state. A boiler room, I think I said this, is you rent the cheapest space for your telephone bank, and you pick the boiler room in the basement of some building, and you put a bunch of people manning the telephones, and they call across state lines. So this confuses the blue sky regulators because it involves two different states. And you call long distance to the other state, and you give. This used to happen a lot. It doesn't happen so much anymore. They would try to sell you on some. I've got a great stock. It's going to triple in 5 days. If you don't buy it today, it's too late. And they would get people into stocks that were utterly worthless, and it was fraud. And so that made it the whole progressive movement to regulate securities was of limited success. But it left in place a huge state and local regulatory system that was considered inadequate to the task, but which remains today for the regulation of smaller companies. The next step is the national regulation, which occurred in the United States in the 1930s under the New Deal of President Roosevelt. So for national, notably in 1934, I mentioned this before, the U.S. government set up it's actually, we spell it out, Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, which regulates the larger firm. Practically, any firm that's listed on a stock exchange would be regulated by them. One of the first directors of the SEC was William O. Douglas, a Yale law professor who wrote a book called Democracy in Finance about his experience as SEC director. And he talked about the conflicts he had with Wall Street at the time. They really didn't like this regulation. It was an antagonistic atmosphere. The Securities and Exchange Commission was widely regarded in the business community as practically a socialist organization. And that's a dirty word in the United States, because it seemed like the government was involving itself in things that they had no business in involving themselves in. So Douglas fought kind of a battle against Wall Street, as detailed in his book. But to get everything on an up-and-up format, he was following one of the rules at Brandeis. The thing is, he wanted disclosure. Louis Brandeis, there's a famous quote in his book, Other People's Money, and it is, quote, "Sunshine is the best disinfectant." That's in a parable to hanging out your clothes on the clothesline and letting the sunlight fall on them, and that disinfects them. But the same idea applies in finance. If everybody knows what the firm is doing, they'll figure it out and there'll be talk. We just don't want firms to keep secrets. So the SEC is built around disclosure. And so I mentioned Edgar is their online information system, but it's on sec.gov. They put everything up about a company that is of any public company up on that website, and it's free, absolutely free to the world. That's disclosure, and that was the motivating thing. Another SEC chairman was Arthur Levitt, and he wrote a book called Take on the Street after he left SEC chairmanship. This was recently, like in the last 10 years. And he told a lot of stories about nasty people on Wall Street. He said he had vivid memories of the reactions he got from proposed new regulations. And he was particularly upset by the kind of ability that Wall Street had to fool people by using complex language that they couldn't understand. They would write prospectuses that no one could understand without a law degree. He wanted plain English. So again, taking a job as SEC chairman or a commissioner on the SEC is taking on a high tension job, I think. But it's just like the same thing as in sports. You know how referees in sports get punched every now and then by the athletes. But we all see that they're necessary. One thing that the SEC does is protects small investors by managing the distinction, I mentioned this before, between public and private securities. So if you want to go public and list your security, or the shares of your company on a stock exchange, you have to go through a procedure defined by the SEC called an IPO. That stands for Initial Public Offering. And to do that procedure, you have to follow a system of rules dictated by the SEC that makes it difficult for you to do any shenanigans, any tricks. It creates a level playing field, and the rules are very strict and enforced by the SEC. The SEC allows other companies to remain private, but it has rules about what you have to do to stay private. When you become a public company, you are involved in the public trust. And you have to, among other things, include all of your documents on sec.gov. But they do allow private companies. And a particularly important category of private company is the so-called hedge fund. A hedge fund is an investment company for wealthy individuals only. And there's, the idea is that small investors need to be protected because they don't know, they don't have expensive advisors and lawyers to tell them what to do. And so lots of controversial things can't be done in funds that are offered to the public. A hedge fund is a fund for these wealthy investors, and the SEC has minimal regulation of them. The Dodd-Frank bill we thought would put more regulation on them, but they're still surviving as largely unregulated organizations. They have different kinds of, there's different, the law, the SEC code of rules is huge and it's complicated. I guess you can read about it on sec.gov, but there's a 3C1S hedge fund. There's one type of hedge fund. It can take on no more than 99 investors. It can't be more than 100. And they must be accredited investors. And the SEC defines accredited investors. That is, they were proposing to change the definition, but I think it's still stuck. To be an accredited investor, I don't have it here. I think it's still that you had to have an income of at least $200,000 a year if you're single, or $300,000 if you're married, or $1 million in investable assets, not including your house. I think that's the definition. I've got it fairly close. So it excludes most investors. But then there's other kinds of hedge funds. There's also a 3C7S hedge fund that's allowed to take on 500 investors. But these have to have a net worth of $5 million. Or if they're an institution, it can't be a little institution. So it would be 5 million. So it's more than accredited investor, it's called super accredited. 5 million for individuals, 25 million for institutions. That excludes most family foundations, I suspect. So hedge funds you don't hear about as much because they don't advertise, and they are not allowed to advertise. If you click on their website, you will find they'll have a website. It will give you the contact information typically and say very little more about them. They don't put anything on their website because they worry that they'd run afoul of the SEC, that the SEC would call it advertising, and you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to be for the public. This creates some conflict. Some people think, why is it that the United States has this kind of two-tier system? It's not just the United States. Other countries have this as well. But let's talk about this system. Why is it that we have special rules for poor people, which in effect, in their estimation, excludes them from some of the biggest profit opportunities? Hedge funds are allowed to impose high management fees, and the typical management fee has been called 2 and 20. 2% of the assets under management goes to the managers every year, and 20% of any trading profits they make go to the managers. Nothing of their trading losses. If they lose money, it doesn't come from the managers. Now that sounds like a really good deal, right? Think about it. If you can raise just $1 billion in your management fund, you're getting 2%. What is 2% of $1 billion? That's 20 million? Did I get that right? And 20% of the profit. I mean, you're going to make a huge amount of money, right? I suspect some of you will do this because it's so tempting. But of course, you can't do this. It's not so easy to start a hedge fund because the whole idea of a hedge fund in most people's minds is there are genius traders, and you got to pay them, right? You can't just you can't hire them cheap. So the hedge funds raid all of the geniuses out of the mutual funds, which are public investment companies for these retail investors. They get the smartest guys and pay them this huge amount. And the idea is they'll make a lot of money. Whether they really do make a lot of money is a difficult question. It's hard to tell because hedge funds haven't been around. They're changing through time. It's a matter. I'm sure some of them do make a lot of money. Some of them are good investments. But it's not. It's like a Wild West. It's a jungle out there. And the SEC doesn't think that you, the small investor, should get involved in that. And so you won't. That's another example. So market surveillance is something that the SEC does, and it does it in connection with the self-regulatory organizations like the stock exchanges. It's again trying to prevent manipulative behavior. So I'll give you an example of market. This is my. See, the markets don't function that well by themselves without some kind of referee. The 1792 stock market crash was only one example. But market surveillance is now a well-established principle to prevent manipulators from taking over a market. I'll give you an example of what happens. And this is a news story from 1995. In May 1995, a secretary at IBM Corporation was asked to copy documents related to secret plans to take over the Lotus Corporation. Okay, Lotus was the spreadsheet, doesn't exist anymore, spreadsheet company that was a pioneer in computer spreadsheets. So anyway, she just commented to her husband because she was copying these documents. She said, oh, IBM was going to take over Lotus. Her husband saw that as valuable information, right? The stock price of Lotus is likely to go up, and she said they were going to do it in 3 days. So that's a perfect thing. So he went, well, anyway, what did he do? He merely telephoned all of his friends and told them, by the takeover date, 25 people had bought $500,000. These people included a pizza chef, an electrical engineer, a bank executive, a dairy wholesaler, a school teacher, and 4 stockbrokers. Okay? Well, they caught them because they saw this unusual activity in the stock, and they subpoenaed their phone records, and they figured out who called who, and they called them in and said, made them declare what they'd done, and they were all punished for this. It's illegal. You can't trade on inside information. Again, the SEC is trying to create a level playing field for everyone. I'll give you another example. It was Emulex Corporation, a former employee of this company, shorted stock in his own former company, and he was then decided he would try to help make the price go down. So he sent, because he knew the company, he knew how to do this. He sent a fake press release to the internet, and nobody suspected it. It looked real. He just sent it out from his own computer. Actually, it wasn't his own computer. He thought he was being smart. He went to the El Camino Community College library. You know the story? Well, you know the college. Well, he went to the library, and he sent the press release from the library's computer, and he thought that's going to be sure. So, and then it worked. It was picked up by all the news services, the bad news about Emulex. And then he immediately recovered his short position, and he made a big profit. And he thought he was smart, but he wasn't smart enough for the surveillance, because they suspected. Well, immediately, it was Emulex immediately protested. We didn't send out this press release. So the market surveillance team went into action, and they found out, it's all in the stock exchange record, who covered a short position right after the announcement. They got his name as one of the people. They actually traced down where the email was sent from, and they went to El Camino Community College, and they talked to the librarians, and they showed them photographs, and they remembered him. And so they nailed this guy. So that's an example of what happens in our markets. And so that makes things work well. See, in this category, I also wanted to mention what the SEC does with creating private organizations or self-regulatory organizations that do some of its jobs. So we have something called FASB, which is called the Financial Accounting Standards Board. It's right here in Connecticut. The SEC decided that companies fake their books in too many ways. There's too much funny business going on, and we need to manage this better. But they didn't want to take over completely this as a government function. So the government recognized a industry group called FASB as the arbiter of accounting standards, and FASB is the authority that defines GAAP accounting standards. And GAAP is an acronym for Generally Accepted Accounting Practices. I'm sorry, principles. Generally accepted accounting principles are defined by a private group. And these principles are used on Edgar, which is the website that the SEC uses to present accounting. So they're in Norwalk, Connecticut, and they have their own website, and you can see how they define accounting standards. I'm running out of time here. I wanted to tell you about another government agency called CIPC. I'm just having too much fun telling you about all these. CIPC is the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, created by the United States Congress in 1970. And it's part of an effort to protect small investors. The CIPC insures your brokerage accounts against losses due to failure of your stockbroker. It corresponds to the FDIC. Did I mention this before? Maybe I mentioned it briefly, but the FDIC is the company that insures your bank account. CIPC is the company that insures your brokerage account, and it's a government corporation. It has limits on the amount that it insures. It was actually created in 1970 in response. A lot of things happened in response to a crisis. There was a brokerage firm called Goodbody that failed in 1970, just before CIPC was created. A lot of people had their stocks in Goodbody, and they had accounts there, and it looked like they were going to lose it. They held their stocks in street name, and I remember telling you about that. So they thought they owned shares, but really Goodbody owned the shares, or they thought Goodbody owned the shares. When Goodbody went under, they ran the risk of losing the shares they thought they owned. So CIPIC was created in order to prevent that. Continuing along on the national level, regulation is getting stronger at the national level. I'll talk about two examples, the U.S., and I'm going to talk about the European Union as if it were a nation. It sort of is a nation. It's an assembly of nations, but it's kind of halfway between national and international. But I'll start with the U.S. I mentioned that in the 1930s there was a big step up in regulation with the New Deal, creating the Securities and Exchange Commission. The next big regulatory push in the United States occurred last year, in 2010. And we had the Dodd-Frank Act. Christopher Dodd was our own senator from Connecticut, and Barney Frank is the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. I'll just give you a couple of things from the Act. One of them is the Act is really trying to push regulation more to the macro-prudential from the micro-prudential. All this thing about fraudulent activities that milk innocent individuals, that was taken care of by previous legislation. Well, not all of it, some of it was. But the Dodd-Frank creates the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC. The Financial Stability Oversight Council is designed to worry about too big to fail. They are the regulator that deals with systemic risk. That is, risk that affects the whole system. They are regulating not just to protect the individual from bad activities, from being fooled, but also to protect the whole system. So that's part of Dodd-Frank. The other part I was going to mention is the consumer. I see it two ways: Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, or Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So I'm not sure how to write the acronym. It hasn't actually taken form yet. I'll say Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. This one is a micro-prudential regulation. I mentioned her before. I think Elizabeth Warren proposed it. She's a Harvard law professor. And what it's going to do is have a government agency that is focused on protecting small investors or borrowers in the mortgage market or the like. Yes, that's right. I can't write always on the blackboard. Thank you. Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. Okay. Elizabeth Warren pointed out, I said this before, that there's a lot of abusive tactics. Now, other regulators weren't so focused on protecting, say, mortgage borrowers or credit card borrowers. And so they were more focused on disclosure and other issues. So the idea in Dodd-Frank is, let's create an agency whose express purpose is protecting the consumer. The idea is that agencies you have to have an agency focused on each problem, and this is a problem that hasn't been dealt with well. I wanted to move to Europe because Europe has had similar legislation also in 2010. So we have the European, okay, I'll write it out, European Supervisory Framework. And that's also 2010. And it consists of a number of things. One, the European Systemic Risk Board, which will be in Frankfurt, well, which is, I think they're just getting started. European Systemic Risk Board is the European counterpart to FSOC. All these things are brand new, and so we don't know too much about how they're going to function yet. But it's supposed to worry about too big to fail and about systems, how the whole European economy could collapse if something goes wrong in the future. Then there's the European Banking Authority. These are big steps for Europe because regulation was more done by the individual countries. And the European Banking Authority is in London. And it will impose Europe-wide banking regulations. And then we have ESMA, the European Securities Market Authority, and that's in Paris. And then there is the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Authority, and that's in Frankfurt. Of course, they spread things out across Europe. They don't want to centralize things. So I don't know why Frankfurt got two of them, but somehow that worked. Finally, I want to do international. If I could just have 5 more minutes of your time. International regulation is a problem because people can leave the country that they're in, and it's called offshore. If you don't like the regulations in the United States, there's always the Bahamas, or there's the Cayman Islands, and you can set up your financial organization with the regulator that you please. That's why it's important for international cooperation and regulation, so that all the financial activity doesn't migrate to the cheapest place, or the cheapest in terms of regulatory cost. But I just wanted to give you a few more institutions that are important. One is the Bank for International Settlements. That's in Basel. This is the oldest of my regulators, 1930. Actually, when we get on the international front, they don't really have authority anymore. They can't impose on anyone, but they can suggest things. So the BIS is a bank that has as members heads of, I think it's 57 central banks, and they meet regularly in Basel to discuss monetary policy. So what comes out of these meetings is suggestions about how to run a central bank. And it has real impact, even though it doesn't have the force of law. Then I wanted to mention the Basel Committee, also in the same city. You notice these are in Switzerland. That's because by long standing it's been a neutral country, and it has such a long tradition of neutrality, so it seems to be the place to set up a lot of international organizations. This was created in 1974, and it issues suggested bank regulation. Basel I was in 1988. That was their first set of recommendations. Basel II was in 2004. And obviously Basel II wasn't successful because we had a huge banking crisis. So we've had Basel III. I'll come back to these in well, it's been going on for years. It was finally approved, Basel III, in 2010. Then I wanted to talk about the G6. Going back to the 1970s, the finance ministers in 6 major countries met together. The countries were France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United States, UK. In 1976, they added Canada, and it became the G7 countries. So that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, US, UK. Who am I missing? Japan, yes, Japan. So these seem to be the most financially prominent countries at the time, and their finance ministers got together and thought about what the country should do, and it coordinated financial regulation somewhat. This expanded notably. I'm just about done now. In 2008, the world is changing, and there was resentment that these countries represent overwhelmingly Europe and the U.S. or the North America. We created the G20 countries in 2008. And I don't have the whole list, but it notably adds China and India, and it adds other developing countries. It now represents most of the world. Again, it's the finance ministers. Well, typically what happens now is the finance ministers will meet, and after that the heads of state will meet. And it's involved in financial regulation. The current president of the G20 is Nicolas Sarkozy from France, and he intends to make it a stronger organization. He has proposed that they have a permanent secretariat. The G20 has created something called the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, and guess where it is? It's in Basel. Everything goes to any of these things that are really, if it's European Union, they'll scatter it around the EU. But if it's really international, it seems to go to Switzerland. Basel is a sleepy little town if you visit it, but somehow it's the center for the world of finance. So the Financial Stability Board is making recommendations for regulatory procedures for the whole world. And they report to the G20, and then the G20, they've already agreed to take FSB seriously. So I think maybe I'm... what I'm seeing here is developing is the financial regulation is becoming more and more large scale, and it's something that covers the whole world. And it's very important because we've just seen a worldwide financial crisis, and it has to be dealt with by worldwide. I think this is an inspiring moment for financial regulation. The G20 seems to be an effective body that is promoting good financial regulation. At this point, this is a good time in history where there's a lot of cooperation. And if it continues and we see this develop further, it will make for a more successful world economy. Today we're going to talk about banking. Before I start, I want just to remind you that we have Hank Greenberg coming on Wednesday. And we talked about him in the previous lecture. But he is one of the most important capitalists, I think, in the world. The firm AIG, which was started by C.V. Starr, was converted into the biggest insurance company in the world by Hank Greenberg. Over many years, the two of them ran AIG exclusively, first Starr and then Greenberg. Greenberg produced a very innovative insurance giant. It didn't end well, but I think I talked to him the other day. He said he's going to talk about the end, what he learned from the experience. Once again, no one can control everything that happens, and random shocks affect all of our lives. He remains a very important, he's no longer at AIG, remains a very important force in our society. Now he's very much involved